Most Wild West towns had almost zero crime, not because of brave sheriffs or gunfights, but because of something so simple it sounds ridiculous. What they did instead of jails will completely change how you think about frontier justice. The American West in the 1800s wasn't just big, it was impossibly, mind-numbingly huge. We're talking about millions of square miles where you could ride for days without seeing another human soul. Most folks back east had no clue what lay beyond the Mississippi River. Maps showed vast blank spaces labeled unexplored territory, or sometimes just here be dragons. Well, maybe not dragons, but definitely something wild and unknown. Then there's this fascinating thing that happened. Towns didn't just appear randomly like mushrooms after rain. They sprouted up wherever people absolutely had to stop. Picture a dusty trail where wagon trains needed water and supplies. Boom, someone sets up a trading post. Before you know it, there's a blacksmith, then a general store, maybe a saloon. Within months you've got yourself a genuine frontier town. The same thing happened around mines when someone struck gold or silver, and later along the railroad lines as they pushed westward like iron snakes across the prairie. But why did people risk everything to head into this wilderness? Land was the biggest draw. The government practically gave it away through the Homestead Act. A family could claim 160 acres for free if they lived on it and farmed it for 5 years. Free land. Try getting that deal today. Of course, free didn't mean easy. Clearing rocks, fighting droughts and surviving brutal winters made homesteading one of the toughest jobs imaginable. Gold fever hit different though. When word spread about strikes in California, Colorado, or Montana, men dropped everything and ran toward the promise of instant wealth. Most never found more than a few flakes, but hope kept them digging. The smart money wasn't in the mines anyway, it was in selling picks, shovels and beams to the miners at outrageous prices. Life in these scattered communities was unlike anything people had experienced before. Your nearest neighbor might live 5 miles away. The closest doctor could be a 3-day ride. Forget about running to the store for milk. Supply wagons came through maybe once a month if you were lucky. Weather, broken wheels or hostile encounters could delay them for weeks. News traveled at the speed of a horse. Events that happened back east took weeks or even months to reach frontier settlements. Families might not know about major wars, presidential elections or family deaths until long after everything was over. Letters were precious treasures, read and reread until they fell apart. These communities developed their own unique rhythms. Everyone knew everyone else's business because privacy was nearly impossible when only 50 people lived within a 20-mile radius. Your survival often depended on your neighbors, so feuds could be deadly serious while friendships ran deeper than family bonds. The isolation created some pretty interesting social dynamics too. Normal rules didn't always apply out here. A former slave might become a respected rancher. All women ran businesses that would have been scandalous back east. Social class mattered less than whether you could handle yourself when trouble came calling, and trouble always seemed to find its way to frontier towns. Supply shortages meant people got creative fast. No nails, whittle wooden pegs. No glass for windows. Stretch oiled paper across frames. No vegetables. Learn which wild plants won't kill you. Frontier folks became masters of making do with whatever they could find, trade for, or cobble together from scraps. Mail delivery was an adventure all by itself. Pony Express riders risked their lives racing across dangerous territory to deliver letters. Later, stagecoaches carried mail along with passengers brave enough to risk robbery or attack. Getting a letter felt like winning the lottery, assuming you could read it and it hadn't been destroyed by rain, mud or worse during the journey. Weather could make or break entire communities. A harsh winter might cut off supplies for months. Drought killed crops and livestock. Prairie fires could wipe out everything a family had worked years to build. Yet people kept coming, drawn by the promise of something better than what they'd left behind. The railroad changed everything when it finally arrived. Towns that got rail connections thrived and grew into real cities. Those bypassed by the tracks often became ghost towns within a few years. The Iron Horse brought reliable supplies, faster communication, and direct connections to markets back east. Suddenly a rancher in Montana could ship cattle to Chicago, and a farmer in Kansas could get his wheat to New York. Children grew up fast in this environment. By age 10, most could handle adult responsibilities, driving wagons, caring for livestock, or helping defend the homestead. Education happened when and where possible. often in one-room schoolhouses that doubled as churches on Sundays and meeting halls for town business. But here's what's really interesting about all this isolation and hardship. It created some of the tightest communities America has ever seen. When your survival depends on cooperation, you learn to work together pretty quickly. Which brings us to an important question. What happened when that cooperation broke down and people started breaking the rules? The Wild West wasn't just a place where cowboys roamed free and outlaws rode into sunset. Real people lived there, ordinary folks who needed groceries, fixed broken wagon wheels, and complained about their neighbors just like everyone else. Farmers made up the biggest group heading west. They wanted cheap land and fresh starts. Back east, good farmland cost a fortune. Out west, the government practically gave it away through the Homestead Act. You could claim 160 acres for almost nothing if you promised to work it for 5 years. Sounds like a great deal, right? Well, many discovered that free land came with free problems like drought, locusts and soil that wouldn't grow much besides tumbleweeds. Then there were the miners. These guys heard gold and dropped everything to chase shiny rocks in California, Colorado and Montana. Most never struck it rich. Instead of finding nuggets the size of chicken eggs, they found backbreaking work in dangerous mines for barely enough money to buy beans and coffee. But hope kept them digging. After all, the next shovelful might change everything. Shopkeepers followed the farmers and miners because someone had to sell them supplies. These business owners often became the most successful people in western towns. While miners went broke chasing gold that wasn't there, smart store owners sold them picks, shovels and dreams. Hardware store owners, blacksmiths and general merchants built steady wealth one sale at a time. Freed slaves joined the westward movement too. After the Civil War ended in 1865, many newly free African Americans saw the West as their chance for real freedom. They became farmers, cowboys, and business owners. Some all-black towns sprouted up in Kansas and Oklahoma. These communities offered something rare, places where black families could vote, own land and run their own affairs without constant threats. But let's not forget the people who were already there. Native American tribes had lived in these empty western lands for thousands of years. The Lakota, Apache, Navajo, and dozens of other tribes had their own towns, trade routes, and ways of life. When settlers called the West unsettled, they meant unsettled by white people. The original inhabitants had been settling it just fine. Thank you very much. Chinese immigrants formed another major group, especially along the West Coast and railroad routes. Many came during California's gold rush in the 1850s, hoping to strike it rich and return home wealthy. Instead, most ended up building the dangerous mountain sections of the Transcontinental Railroad, or working in mines that white miners had abandoned. They faced harsh discrimination and unfair laws, but they built thriving Chinatowns in cities like San Francisco and smaller settlements throughout the West. Cowboys get all the movie fame, but they were really just workers. Most were young men, including many Mexican vaqueros who knew cattle handling better than anyone. They moved herds from Texas ranches to railroad towns in Kansas and Nebraska. The work was hot, dirty, and dangerous. A typical cattle drive lasted months and paid about $1 a day. Not exactly the glamorous life Hollywood shows us. The weird part is how mixed up these communities became. A typical western town might have German farmers, Irish railroad workers, Chinese laundrymen, Mexican cowboys, former slaves from the South, and New England school teachers all living on the same street. Languages mixed together in the general store. Spanish words became English. Chinese cooking influenced local restaurants. Everyone borrowed survival tricks from Native American tribes. Women made up a smaller portion of early Western settlers, which created its own set of problems and opportunities. Some towns had 10 men for every woman. This shortage meant women could be picky about marriage partners, and often found more independence than they'd have back east. Some became successful business owners, running boarding houses, restaurants, or even saloons. Religious groups also headed west seeking freedom to practice their beliefs. Mormons famously settled Utah after facing persecution elsewhere. German Mennonites established farming communities in Kansas. These religious settlers often created the most organized and successful towns because they arrived with shared values and cooperative work systems. Drifters and gamblers rounded out the mix. These men moved from town to town, following construction jobs, seasonal work, or just staying ahead of trouble. They weren't necessarily criminals, but they weren't putting down roots either. Every western town had a few characters who'd been everywhere and had stories to prove it. What made western communities really different was how temporary everything felt. People knew their neighbors might pack up and leave next week. Towns appeared and disappeared based on whether the mine played out or the railroad changed routes. This constant motion created a strange mix of close cooperation and emotional distance. Communities had to work together to survive harsh winters, Indian raids or economic disasters, but they also knew not to get too attached to people or places. Makes sense when your whole town might be ghost town material in 5 years. All these different groups had to figure out how to live together without killing each other. And here's where things get interesting. What happens when there's no police force to keep the peace? Before any sheriff pinned on a badge or judge banged a gavel, Wild West towns had to figure out right from wrong on their own. No police academy existed out here. No courthouse stood ready with marble columns and fancy legal procedures. When someone stole your horse or cheated at cards, you couldn't dial 911 or file a complaint downtown. The law was whatever the community decided it should be that particular day. Most settlers brought their sense of justice from back east, but frontier life had a way of changing the rules pretty quickly. A farmer from Ohio might have believed in long trials and careful evidence back home. Out here, when winter was coming, and someone rustled his only cow, patience felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. The harsh reality was simple. Communities had to police themselves or face complete chaos. Neighbor justice became the backbone of early law enforcement. When disputes arose between families over land boundaries or water rights, the whole settlement often gathered to hash things out. These weren't formal trials with lawyers and legal precedents. They were more like heated town meetings where everyone got to speak their piece. The loudest voices didn't always win, but the majority usually decided who was right and who needed to make things square. Then there were the more serious crimes that demanded immediate action. Horse theft could leave a family stranded hundreds of miles from civilization. Murder threatened everyone's safety in a community where people depended on each other for survival. When these crimes happened, waiting months for a traveling judge wasn't just impractical, it was dangerous. Swift punishment became the norm, not because people were bloodthirsty, but because they were practical. Public punishments served multiple purposes in these tight-knit communities. A thief tied to a post in the town square wasn't just paying for his crime, he was providing a lesson for everyone watching. Kids saw what happened to people who took things that didn't belong to them. Adults were reminded that the community was watching their behavior. The punishment became a form of education that courtrooms and prisons couldn't provide. Banishment turned out to be surprisingly effective in the Wild West. Running someone out of town might sound like a mild punishment, but consider the reality. These settlements were often the only civilization for hundreds of miles. Getting kicked out meant facing wolves, hostile weather, and starvation alone. Most people preferred almost any other punishment to being cast into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Community standards varied wildly from place to place, creating a patchwork of informal legal codes across the frontier. A mining camp might tolerate gambling and heavy drinking, but come down hard on claim jumping. A farming settlement might ban alcohol entirely, but show mercy to someone who stole food for hungry children. Religious communities often had stricter moral codes, while cattle towns developed their own rough sense of cowboy justice. The absence of prisons created interesting solutions to crime and punishment. Building a proper jail required time, money, and materials that most settlements simply didn't have. Instead, communities got creative. Minor offenders might be sentenced to hard labor building roads or chopping firewood for widows. Repeat troublemakers faced increasingly harsh social pressure until they either reformed or left town voluntarily. Women played crucial roles in this informal justice system, even though they rarely held official positions. Mothers, wives, and sisters often determined community standards through social pressure and moral influence. A stern talking to from the preacher's wife could be more effective than a night in jail. Women organized boycotts against dishonest merchants and spread word about men who mistreated their families. This informal network of female judgment shaped behavior in ways that formal law enforcement couldn't match. Violence did erupt when communities couldn't agree on justice, or when emotions ran too high for rational discussion. Without professional lawmen to maintain order, disputes could escalate quickly from shouting matches to shootings. Some settlements experienced periods of genuine lawlessness when competing factions refused to accept any shared authority. These were the towns that either evolved quickly toward formal law enforcement or simply didn't survive. Record-keeping during this period was spotty at best, but surviving accounts show that most communities took their responsibility seriously. Town leaders tried to ensure that punishments fit crimes and that everyone received fair treatment regardless of their background or popularity. They understood that arbitrary justice would destroy the trust needed to hold their fragile settlements together. The weird part is how well this system often worked, despite its obvious flaws. Communities that successfully policed themselves built reputations that attracted more settlers and investors. Towns known for fairness and order grew into prosperous cities, while those plagued by violence and corruption withered away or exploded into chaos. But this informal justice system had built-in limitations that became more obvious as towns grew larger and more complex. What worked for 50 people who all knew each other started breaking down when populations reached hundreds or thousands. Personal relationships that had made neighbor justice possible became impossible to maintain, and the need for professional lawmen became increasingly urgent. Most frontier towns started without any law enforcement at all. No badges, no jails, no official authority keeping the peace. But as settlements grew and problems mounted, communities faced a choice: live with chaos, or find someone willing to pin on a star and take charge. The solution was surprisingly democratic. Towns simply elected their own marshals and sheriffs. No special training required, no background checks, no fancy qualifications needed. If you could handle a gun and people trusted you, congratulations, you might just become the law. This wasn't exactly a rigorous hiring process, but desperate times called for creative solutions. County sheriffs handled larger areas outside town limits, while town marshals kept order within city boundaries. The difference mattered, but both jobs shared one thing in common: terrible pay and long hours. Many lawmen earned less than store clerks, which explains why finding volunteers wasn't always easy. Some towns went years without any official sheriff simply because nobody wanted the job. Here's where things get interesting. Many marshals weren't full-time lawmen at all. They kept their day jobs as farmers, shopkeepers, saloon owners, or blacksmiths. Being the town marshal was often a side hustle that came with more headaches than profit. Imagine arresting someone on Saturday night, then selling them groceries on Monday morning. Makes for awkward small talk, right? The equipment situation was equally makeshift. Lawmen provided their own guns, horses, and often their own jail keys. No standardized uniforms existed. Some marshals wore badges made from hammered silver coins or carved wood. Others simply announced their authority verbally and hoped people would listen. Professional police departments with matching uniforms and proper training were still decades away. Election day could make or break a lawman's career. Unlike modern police chiefs with job security, marshals served at the pleasure of the voters. Upset enough people with your decisions, and you'd be out of work faster than a card cheat in an honest game. This kept most lawmen focused on what the community actually wanted, not what distant politicians demanded. Then there's the reality of frontier politics. Towns split along various lines: ranchers versus farmers, business owners versus workers, long-time residents versus newcomers. A marshal who sided too heavily with one group risked making enemies of another. Smart lawmen learned to walk carefully between competing interests, settling disputes without picking permanent sides. Some marshals lasted decades in the same town, becoming beloved community figures. Others barely survived their first month before quitting or getting voted out. The turnover rate was enormous, partly because the job attracted drifters, and partly because few people could handle the stress long-term. Violence was always a possibility, but dealing with drunks, settling neighbor disputes, and collecting fines proved equally exhausting. Training was non-existent in most places. New marshals learned by doing, making mistakes, and hopefully surviving their education. Experienced lawmen sometimes shared advice, but no formal academy or handbook existed. You figured out how to break up fights, track criminals, and maintain order through trial and error. The error part could be dangerous. Many towns couldn't afford to pay their marshal a regular salary. Instead, they used a fee system. Lawmen kept fines they collected or received payment for specific services. This created interesting incentives. A marshal might focus more on catching petty criminals who could pay fines than pursuing serious felons who couldn't. The system worked, sort of, but it wasn't exactly fair. Election campaigns for marshal positions were often colorful affairs. Candidates promised to clean up the town, reduce crime, and restore order. Some ran on platforms of strict enforcement, while others pledged a gentler touch. Saloon owners sometimes backed candidates who would go easy on drinking-related offenses. Merchants preferred marshals who would crack down on theft and robbery. The weird part is how quickly some of these amateur lawmen became genuinely effective. Men who'd never worn a badge before learned to read people, diffuse tense situations, and command respect through presence rather than violence. Natural leadership skills mattered more than formal training, and some farmers turned marshals proved remarkably good at maintaining peace. Community support made all the difference. Towns that backed their marshals with volunteer pauses and moral authority saw better results than places where lawmen stood alone. Citizens who complained constantly, but offered no help, usually got exactly the kind of law enforcement they deserved, which wasn't much. Weather, distance, and communication problems complicated everything. A marshal might need to travel 50 miles to arrest someone, with no guarantee the suspect would still be there upon arrival. No radios, no telephones, no backup, except whatever help you could organize locally. Every arrest was potentially dangerous because help was often hours or days away. But here's what really mattered about these early lawmen. They represented the community's first serious attempt to replace vigilante justice with something more organized and fair. The system was imperfect, sometimes corrupt, and frequently ineffective. Yet it marked an important step toward actual civilization in the frontier. Of course, having a marshal was only half the battle. What happened when someone actually broke the law? That's where things got really interesting, and where many towns discovered that catching criminals was easier than figuring out what to do with them once you had them locked up. Walking into Dodge City in 1877, you'd spot something that might surprise you. Right there at the edge of town stood a wooden sign that basically said, "Leave your guns here." Yeah, you heard that right. The Wild West, that legendary land of shootouts and gunfighters, actually banned guns in most of its towns. Tombstone, Arizona did the same thing. So did Wichita, Abilene, and dozens of other frontier settlements. The famous cattle town of Caldwell, Kansas, went even further, posting signs that warned visitors they'd face a $25 fine for carrying firearms within city limits. That's about $800 in today's money. Makes sense when you think about it. Nobody wanted drunken cowboys shooting up their businesses after a long cattle drive. Well, how exactly did this work? Most towns set up a simple system. You rode into town, spotted the no firearms signs, then headed straight to the sheriff's office or the nearest hotel. There, you'd check your guns like you might check your coat at a fancy restaurant. The sheriff would hand you a little metal token with a number on it. When you were ready to leave town, you'd trade the token back for your weapon. Some places made it even easier. Business owners near the town limits would store guns for a small fee. Hotels often provided gun storage as part of their service. The railroad depot in Dodge City kept a special rack where travelers could leave their weapons before heading into the business district. But why did frontier towns care so much about gun control? Money, plain and simple. These communities were trying to build legitimate businesses, attract families, and create stable economies. Having armed strangers wandering around town was bad for business. Store owners didn't want nervous customers. Hotel keepers didn't want guests worrying about getting shot in their sleep. Restaurant owners certainly didn't want gunfights breaking out during dinner service. Then there's the practical side of things. Most of these gun ordinances weren't really about stopping hardened criminals. Outlaws rarely strolled down Main Street in broad daylight anyway. The laws targeted everyday problems like heated arguments between drunk card players, disputes over business deals gone wrong, or simple misunderstandings that could turn deadly when everyone was armed. The enforcement wasn't always perfect, of course. Some visitors ignored the signs and kept their guns hidden. Others claimed they needed weapons for protection on dangerous trails just outside town. A few argued they were just passing through and shouldn't have to disarm. Smart sheriffs learned to spot concealed weapons and developed techniques for persuading reluctant visitors to follow local rules. And the weird part is how well most people cooperated with these gun laws. Cowboys, miners, and settlers generally understood the reasoning behind the restrictions. They wanted safe places to spend their money, get medical care, conduct business, and rest between journeys. Even tough frontier folks appreciated being able to walk around town without constantly watching for trouble. Penalties for violating gun ordinances varied from place to place. Some towns imposed hefty fines, others sentenced violators to a few days in the local jail. Repeat offenders might get banned from town entirely, a serious punishment in regions where the next settlement could be 50 miles away. A few communities made gun violations punishable by immediate expulsion, meaning troublemakers got escorted to the town limits and told never to come back. Let's not forget that these laws applied to almost everyone, including local residents. Town marshals and sheriffs carried weapons as part of their official duties, but ordinary citizens were expected to keep their firearms at home or stored somewhere safe. Even business owners who kept guns for protection usually had to register them with local authorities. The success of frontier gun control depended heavily on community support. When local merchants, hotel owners and residents backed the restrictions, visiting strangers had little choice but to comply. Nobody wanted to get into arguments with an entire town. Word spread quickly along cattle trails and mining circuits about which communities enforced their weapon laws strictly and which ones were more relaxed. Some towns got creative with their enforcement strategies. They positioned deputies at key entry points to intercept armed visitors before they reached the main business district. Others relied on bartenders and hotel clerks to remind guests about local gun ordinances. A few communities offered discounts at certain businesses for people who voluntarily checked their weapons. These gun laws worked so well that violent crime rates in most frontier towns stayed remarkably low. Saloon fights involved fists instead of bullets. Business disputes got settled with words rather than weapons. Even personal grudges rarely escalated to deadly violence when the feuding parties couldn't easily access firearms. But laws are only as good as the people enforcing them. The success of frontier gun control depended entirely on having capable lawmen willing to confront armed visitors and convince them to comply. This created some interesting challenges for the marshals and sheriffs responsible for keeping the peace, challenges that would test their courage, diplomacy and survival skills in ways that might surprise you. Contrary to what Hollywood wants you to believe, the Wild West wasn't exactly swimming in blood. Most frontier towns were actually safer than the big cities back east. We're talking about places where a single murder could be the talk of the town for years, not because people were easily shocked, but because it was genuinely rare. Take Dodge City, supposedly one of the roughest towns in Kansas. Between 1876 and 1885, this legendary hellraiser of a settlement recorded exactly 15 murders. That's fewer than 2 per year in a town famous for being dangerous. Compare that to New York City during the same period, where you'd find that many bodies in a single weekend. The numbers just don't match the reputation. Bank robberies, even rarer. From 1859 to 1900, fewer than 10 banks were actually robbed in the entire American West. Think about that for a second. 4 decades of supposed lawlessness, and you could count all the bank heists on your fingers. Jesse James and his gang might have grabbed headlines, but they weren't exactly starting a trend. Most banks went their entire existence without ever seeing a masked man with a gun. Then there's the whole gunslinging cowboy myth. Most people didn't even own firearms, let alone carry them around looking for trouble. Guns were expensive, ammunition cost money that most folks didn't have to spare, and frankly there wasn't much need for them in daily life. A shopkeeper in Tombstone was far more likely to own a broom than a Colt .45. But why do we think the Wild West was so violent? Well, newspapers had bills to pay just like today. A headline reading, "Nothing happened in Deadwood yesterday," wasn't exactly going to sell papers. Stories about Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning apple pie couldn't compete with tales of shootouts and desperados. Editors quickly learned that a little embellishment could turn a bar scuffle into a legendary gunfight. The reality was much more mundane. Most towns kept detailed records of their problems, and those records paint a picture of communities dealing with the same petty crimes you'd find anywhere. Drunkenness, disturbing the peace, the occasional theft of a chicken or a horse. Not exactly the stuff of legend, but that's what actually filled the sheriff's logbook. Violence, when it did occur, usually happened in very specific circumstances. Mining camps during the first rush of gold fever saw more bloodshed, but even then, it was typically disputes over claims or gambling debts gone wrong. Cattle towns might see a spike in trouble when trail drivers arrived after months on the range, but these were predictable problems that communities learned to manage. What's really interesting is how communities responded to crime when it did happen. Since professional law enforcement was scarce, people had to get creative. A horse thief might find himself facing not just the sheriff, but an entire town that depended on those animals for survival. The social pressure alone was often enough to keep most folks honest. Even the famous cattle rustling, supposedly the crime of choice for Wild West outlaws, was less common than you'd think. Stealing livestock was serious business precisely because it was so devastating to ranchers, but it required organization, local knowledge, and somewhere to sell the stolen animals. Most opportunistic criminals stuck to easier targets. The murder rates tell the real story. While some mining boomtowns did see spikes in violence during their wild early days, established settlements often went years without a single homicide. Ellsworth, Kansas, had exactly 1 murder in 1873, and the local newspaper treated it like the crime of the century, because for them, it practically was. Churches, schools, and community organizations worked hard to maintain order through social pressure rather than force. A reputation as a troublemaker, could mean the end of your business prospects, social connections, and even your ability to find a place to live. In small communities where everyone knew everyone else, this kind of social enforcement was incredibly powerful. The few truly violent incidents that did occur became the foundation for decades of stories and legends. That's human nature. We remember the dramatic exceptions, not the boring everyday reality. A single shootout could define a town's reputation for generations, even if nothing remotely similar ever happened again. Even contemporary visitors to the Wild West often commented on how peaceful and orderly they found frontier communities. European travelers expecting to witness daily gunfights instead found people focused on building businesses, raising families, and creating stable communities. The disappointed tourists sometimes went home and wrote about the violence they'd expected to see, rather than the calm reality they actually experienced. The real story of Wild West crime isn't about fast draws and bank robbers. It's about ordinary people creating order in extraordinary circumstances, using common sense and community cooperation to build safe places to live. But that kind of methodical problem-solving doesn't make for exciting campfire stories, which brings us to an interesting question about where all that violence everybody expected was actually happening. Not every Wild West town was created equal when it came to danger. Some places were genuinely rough, and understanding where the real violence happened tells us a lot about what made communities safe or deadly. Mining camps topped the list for bloodshed. These weren't established towns with families and churches. They were temporary settlements that popped up overnight when someone struck gold or silver. Thousands of men would flood into these camps within weeks, all chasing the same dream of getting rich quick. The problem, most of them were strangers carrying cash, weapons, and big expectations. When those expectations crashed into reality, things got ugly fast. Take the California gold rush camps of the 1850s. Places like Bodie had murder rates that would make modern Detroit look peaceful. We're talking about one murder for every few hundred residents each year. Compare that to established farming towns where a single killing might shock the community for decades. The math was simple: more desperate people, plus no established law equals more violence. But here's what made mining camps particularly dangerous. They attracted exactly the wrong crowd. Professional gamblers showed up to fleece naive miners. Con artists arrived with get-rich-quick schemes. Criminals came because they knew these places had money and no sheriffs. Then there were the claim jumpers, thieves, who'd kill a man just to steal his patch of dirt. Saloons and gambling halls were the epicenters of most violence, regardless of what type of town you lived in. These weren't just places to grab a drink after work. They were combination bars, casinos, hotels, and sometimes brothels all rolled into one building. Money changed hands constantly. Alcohol flowed freely. Men carried guns and had strong opinions about card games and honor. The deadliest moments usually came when someone got caught cheating at cards. Accusations would fly, chairs would get thrown, and suddenly everyone was reaching for their weapons. Professional gamblers often carried multiple derringers hidden in their clothing because they knew their line of work came with occupational hazards. Smart saloon owners hired armed security, but even bouncers couldn't stop every fight from turning fatal. Isolated settlements faced unique dangers that bigger towns avoided. When you're 50 miles from the nearest neighbor and 100 miles from any law enforcement, problems tend to solve themselves through violence. These remote communities had no one to call for help when things went wrong. Disputes over land, water rights, or livestock could escalate quickly because there was no sheriff to cool things down and no judge coming through anytime soon. Family feuds were particularly deadly in isolated areas. What might have been settled with fines or jail time in an established town could turn into multi-generational blood feuds lasting years. The infamous Hatfield-McCoy conflict wasn't unique. Dozens of similar family wars played out across the frontier, wherever communities were too scattered to maintain effective law enforcement. Cattle towns experienced seasonal spikes in violence that followed a predictable pattern. Most of the year, places like Abilene and Dodge City were relatively quiet farming communities. But when the trail drives arrived after months on the open range, everything changed overnight. Hundreds of cowboys would flood into town with months of wages burning holes in their pockets and months of pent-up energy looking for release. These cowboys weren't necessarily bad men, but they were young, armed, and eager to blow off steam after driving cattle across dangerous territory for weeks. They'd hit the saloons, gambling halls, and brothels all at once. Mix alcohol, gambling, and competition for female attention among armed men who'd been living rough, and violence was almost inevitable. The smart towns prepared for these seasonal invasions by hiring extra deputies and implementing strict gun control during cattle season. The first few years of any settlement's existence were statistically the most dangerous. New towns attracted drifters, speculators, and people running from something back east. There were no established families, no community leaders, and no social pressure to behave. Everyone was a stranger, which meant nobody had much reason to care about their reputation or long-term relationships. Well-established communities with schools, churches, and family businesses were remarkably peaceful by comparison. When everyone knows everyone else and plans to stick around for decades, people have strong incentives to get along. Your reputation mattered when you'd be dealing with the same neighbors for the rest of your life. The geographical factor played a huge role too. Towns along major transportation routes, railroad stops, river crossings, or trail junctions saw more transient population and more crime. Remote settlements might be violent, but established towns on busy routes faced different challenges from the constant stream of strangers passing through. Understanding these crime hotspots helps explain why the Wild West had such a mixed reputation for violence. Some places really were as dangerous as the legends suggest, while others were more peaceful than eastern cities. But even in the roughest mining camps and cattle towns, most violence was concentrated in specific places and times rather than being a constant feature of daily life. The question becomes, how did communities respond when violence got completely out of hand and local law enforcement couldn't cope? Sometimes local marshals and sheriffs weren't enough. When violence spiraled out of control or major conflicts erupted, Western towns had only one option left: call in the United States Army. These weren't your typical law enforcement situations anymore. We're talking about full-blown chaos that required trained soldiers with real firepower. The army didn't show up for bar fights or cattle rustling. They arrived when entire communities faced extinction. Native American raids could wipe out settlements overnight. Mining camp wars between rival groups sometimes left dozens dead. Railroad workers faced attacks from hostile tribes protecting their ancestral lands. When bullets started flying and bodies started dropping, local lawmen quickly realized they were in over their heads. Army posts dotted the western landscape like military islands in an ocean of uncertainty. Fort Laramie, Fort Apache, Fort Worth. These weren't just cool names on a map. They were lifelines for desperate settlers who knew that blue uniforms meant the difference between survival and slaughter. Cavalry units could cover ground faster than any posse, and their Springfield rifles packed more punch than civilian weapons. But here's where it gets interesting. The army wasn't some Wild West police force. They had bigger fish to fry than settling disputes over poker games or stolen chickens. Their main job involved protecting mail routes, railroad construction crews, and major settlements from large-scale attacks. A single murder wouldn't bring federal troops to your town. A massacre might. Communication posed serious challenges in calling for military help. No telephones existed in most frontier areas. Towns sent riders on horseback, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles to reach the nearest army post. These desperate messengers faced the same dangers that threatened their communities: hostile territory, severe weather, and the constant risk of ambush. Many never made it to their destination. The weird part is how quickly army intervention could transform a lawless hellhole into a functioning community. Soldiers didn't just fight, they provided structure, discipline, and protection that allowed normal life to resume. Merchants reopened their stores. Families came out of hiding, children played in streets again. Military presence created breathing room for local authorities to re-establish control. Army camps also served another crucial purpose: protecting crucial infrastructure. Telegraph lines, railroad tracks, and mail stations needed constant security in hostile territory. Without these communication and transportation networks, isolated towns would remain cut off from the rest of America. Soldiers guarded construction crews, repaired damaged lines, and maintained supply routes that kept frontier communities alive. Let's not forget the logistics nightmare of military operations in the middle of nowhere. Army units needed supplies, ammunition, food, and medical care just like everyone else. Remote posts often ran short on everything from bullets to beans. Soldiers sometimes went months without proper equipment or reinforcements, yet they maintained order in regions where chaos reigned supreme. The relationship between army officers and civilian leaders wasn't always smooth. Military commanders followed federal orders, not local preferences. Town officials might want troops to stay permanently, but army brass had other priorities. Conflicts arose over jurisdiction, resource allocation, and strategic decisions. who had final authority when both military and civilian leaders claimed control. Native American conflicts created the most dramatic need for army intervention. Tribes defending their ancestral territories launched coordinated attacks against encroaching settlements. The Sioux, Apache, Comanche, and other groups possessed superior knowledge of local terrain and guerrilla warfare tactics. Settler militias and town marshals stood little chance against experienced warriors fighting for their homeland. These weren't simple good versus evil scenarios either. Broken treaties, stolen land, and cultural misunderstandings fueled cycles of violence that claimed lives on both sides. Army officers often found themselves enforcing policies they personally questioned. Some developed genuine respect for Native American leaders and tried to negotiate peaceful solutions. Others embraced total warfare as the only path to civilization. Timeline mattered enormously in military responses. Help could arrive within days if an army post sat nearby. More commonly, weeks passed before soldiers reached threatened communities. By then, attackers had long since disappeared into vast wilderness areas. Frustrated troops found empty settlements, buried bodies, and cold trails leading nowhere. The presence of federal troops also attracted different types of troublemakers. Deserters, discharged soldiers, and military suppliers created their own criminal networks around army posts. Some of these men possessed combat experience and military-grade weapons, making them particularly dangerous opponents for local lawmen. Once immediate threats subsided, army units typically moved on to other crisis zones. They weren't permanent police forces for individual towns. Their departure often left communities wondering when violence might return. Smart settlements used military protection periods to strengthen their own defenses, recruit better lawmen, and build lasting institutions. The Army's role in frontier justice reveals how thin the line was between civilization and chaos in the Wild West. Federal troops provided the ultimate backup when local systems collapsed completely. But what happened when communities couldn't wait for military rescue? That's where desperate citizens took justice into their own hands, forming groups that answered to no authority except themselves. When official lawmen were nowhere to be found, ordinary citizens took matters into their own hands. Vigilante justice wasn't some Hollywood invention. It was a real, organized response to the chaos that could grip Wild West communities overnight. These weren't random mobs with pitchforks and torches. Well, not usually. Vigilante groups called themselves committees of safety, or citizens' committees, and they operated more like unofficial courts than angry crowds. The Montana Vigilantes, active in the 1860s, kept detailed written records of their proceedings. They recorded evidence, listed witnesses, and even appointed judges from among respected community members. But here's the thing about vigilante justice. It filled a dangerous gap. When the nearest official sheriff lived 3 days' ride away and winter snows blocked mountain passes for months, what exactly were people supposed to do with suspected horse thieves and murderers? Let them roam free until spring. The process often followed a predictable pattern. Citizens would form a committee after a particularly shocking crime, or when several incidents piled up. They'd capture suspects, hold what resembled a trial, and deliver swift punishment. Whipping was common for minor offenses. Exile meant forcing someone to leave town permanently, and if they returned, worse punishment awaited. Then there was hanging. Vigilantes reserved this ultimate penalty for murders, repeated horse theft, or other crimes they considered unforgivable. The vigilante committees in San Francisco executed 4 men in 1851 and hanged another 4 in 1856. Each execution followed what the committees called due process, though modern courts might disagree with their definition. What's fascinating is how seriously these groups took their temporary authority. The Helena, Montana Vigilantes created elaborate secret signs and passwords. Members received numbered badges and swore oaths of secrecy. They established rules about when to act and how many votes were needed for different punishments. Some committees even kept treasuries to pay for ropes, guards, and other operational expenses. Not every vigilante group operated with such organization, though. Smaller towns might see a dozen angry citizens band together for a single incident, then dissolve immediately afterward. These impromptu groups were more likely to make mistakes, like the Colorado mining camp that nearly hanged an innocent man before someone recognized him as a traveling preacher, not the claim jumper they were hunting. The weird part is how vigilante justice actually worked pretty well in many cases. Communities that had suffered months of unchecked crime often saw immediate improvement after vigilante action. Word spread quickly across the frontier when vigilantes cleaned up a town. Potential troublemakers learned to avoid places where citizens had proven they'd fight back, but vigilante justice came with serious risks. Personal grudges could masquerade as community justice. Ethnic minorities faced unfair targeting. Chinese miners and Mexican settlers were sometimes accused of crimes they didn't commit. Economic competition played a role too. Established merchants might use vigilante committees to drive away business rivals by accusing them of theft or fraud. The most famous vigilante organization controlled large portions of Montana Territory for several years. Between 1863 and 1865, the Montana vigilantes hanged at least 21 men, including the corrupt Sheriff Henry Plummer and most of his gang. They posted warnings written on pieces of paper and signed March 7, 77, numbers that supposedly represented the dimensions of a grave, though nobody knows for certain what the code meant. These Montana vigilantes faced a genuine crisis. Plummer's gang had been robbing gold shipments and murdering travelers for months while he used his sheriff's badge as cover. Official territorial authorities were hundreds of miles away. Citizens felt they had no choice but to organize their own justice system. Communities usually disbanded vigilante groups once official law enforcement arrived. Professional lawmen didn't appreciate competition, and most citizens preferred having trained officers handle dangerous situations. The transition wasn't always smooth though. Some vigilante leaders expected to be appointed as official marshals or sheriffs, creating tension when communities chose different candidates. Religious leaders often supported vigilante justice, seeing it as necessary for protecting innocent families. Ministers frequently served on vigilante committees and offered prayers before executions. Churches sometimes provided meeting spaces for citizen committees, blending moral authority with practical law enforcement. Women participated in vigilante movements too, though usually behind the scenes. They gathered evidence, provided food for committee meetings, and helped decide which punishments fit specific crimes. Some women openly supported vigilante hangings, viewing them as protection for their children and homes. The legacy of vigilante justice shaped how many Western communities viewed law enforcement long after official systems took over. Towns that had successfully organized citizen committees often maintained strong neighborhood watch programs and active community involvement in local policing decisions. As professional lawmen established regular patrol routes and territorial courts began operating, vigilante committees gradually faded away, but their influence lingered in the attitudes of Western communities toward taking responsibility for their own safety and justice. The question remained though, what happened when even these citizen committees couldn't handle the scale of violence erupting between different groups competing for the same land? Most settlers heading west figured they'd find empty land just waiting for them. Boy, were they wrong. Millions of Native Americans had called these territories home for thousands of years. The Cherokee, Lakota, Apache, Comanche, and dozens of other tribes weren't about to pack up and leave because some folks with wagons showed up claiming ownership. The collision was inevitable. Settlers wanted farmland, cattle ranges, and mining claims. Native tribes wanted to keep their hunting grounds, sacred sites, and traditional territories. When two groups both believe they have the right to the same piece of earth, trouble follows fast. Government officials in Washington made things worse by signing treaties they had no intention of keeping. They'd promise tribes specific boundaries, then look the other way when settlers crossed those lines. The Homestead Act of 1862 practically invited families to claim 160 acres anywhere they could manage it. Problem was, anywhere often meant someone else's ancestral homeland. Violence erupted in waves across the frontier. Some conflicts lasted days, others dragged on for years. The Dakota War of 1862 left hundreds dead in Minnesota when promises of food and supplies never materialized during a harsh winter. Desperate and starving, Dakota warriors attacked settlements before the U.S. Army crushed their resistance. Then there's the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where Colorado militia slaughtered peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho villagers flying American flags. The attack violated every rule of war and common decency. Even other military officers called it murder. But the damage was done, and trust between communities shattered completely. Native American war parties responded with their own raids on isolated farms and small towns. Families might wake up to find their livestock stolen, their crops burned, or worse. Some settlements were abandoned entirely when residents fled back east or to larger, better defended towns. Ghost towns dotted the landscape where fear had won. The weird part is how unevenly these conflicts played out. One valley might see constant skirmishes while the next valley over enjoyed peaceful trade relationships. Some native leaders like Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce tried diplomacy first, only fighting when forced to defend their people. Others, like Geronimo, chose warfare from the start. Army posts sprouted up wherever tensions ran highest. Fort Laramie, Fort Apache, and dozens of others served as headquarters for military campaigns and safe havens for settlers. Soldiers weren't really lawmen in the traditional sense. They were there to fight wars, not solve everyday crimes. But when your town faced attack, the difference didn't matter much. What made these conflicts particularly brutal was how different the two sides approached warfare. European-style military thinking emphasized big battles, clear victories, and formal surrenders. Many Native American tribes preferred quick strikes, strategic retreats, and guerrilla tactics that drove their enemies crazy. Neither side fully understood the other's methods, leading to escalating violence and mutual accusations of unfair fighting. Railroad construction added another layer of conflict. Companies needed clear, safe routes for their tracks and work crews. Native tribes saw the iron horse as a threat to buffalo herds and a symbol of white expansion. Attacks on railroad workers became common enough that companies hired armed guards and requested military escorts for construction teams. Buffalo hunting nearly triggered its own war. White hunters killed millions of buffalo for their hides, leaving the meat to rot. For Plains tribes who depended on buffalo for food, clothing, and shelter, this wasn't just waste. It was cultural genocide. Warriors fought desperately to protect the herds, knowing their entire way of life hung in the balance. Let's not forget how these conflicts affected everyday law and order in frontier towns. Local sheriffs and marshals had their hands full with regular crime. When war parties threatened, civilian lawmen often stepped aside and let the army take charge. Town officials worried more about defense than catching cattle rustlers or breaking up saloon fights. Some communities tried finding middle ground. Trading posts became neutral zones where both sides could do business safely. Mixed blood interpreters helped negotiate temporary truces. A few towns even hired Native Americans as scouts or guides, though this arrangement made both sides suspicious. Peace treaties kept getting signed and broken in an endless cycle. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge in 1867 was supposed to end Plains Indian wars by establishing clear reservations. Within 5 years, fighting had resumed worse than ever. Government negotiators promised things they couldn't deliver, while tribal leaders faced pressure from younger warriors who wanted to keep fighting. By the 1880s, most major conflicts had ended through a combination of military defeat, disease, and sheer exhaustion. Surviving tribes were forced onto reservations, often far from their original homelands. The frontier's most dangerous period was essentially over, though tensions lingered for generations. These land disputes and their violent aftermath shaped how law enforcement developed across the West. Military-style responses to major threats became the template for handling serious crime. But what happened when towns needed to investigate murders, track down thieves, or solve other everyday crimes without an army to help? When someone died violently, or property went missing in a Wild West town, there wasn't exactly a CSI team waiting to spring into action. Most settlements had maybe 50 to a few hundred people, and professional detectives were about as common as unicorns. Instead, ordinary folks had to figure out what happened using whatever methods they could cobble together. The coroner usually kicked things off. Now, don't picture some fancy medical examiner with a lab coat and sophisticated equipment. The town coroner might be the local doctor, the barber, or sometimes just whoever happened to be literate enough to write a decent report. Their job was simple: look at the body, talk to witnesses, and decide if someone died from natural causes, an accident, or foul play. But here's where it gets interesting. The coroner couldn't work alone. Frontier law required a coroner's jury, 6 to 12 local citizens who had to examine the evidence and reach a verdict. These weren't trained investigators. They were farmers, shopkeepers, maybe a preacher or two. The blacksmith might find himself studying bullet wounds one morning, then shoeing horses that afternoon. These jury members took their duties seriously, though. They'd gather around the body, often right where it was found, and start asking questions. Who saw the victim last? Did anyone hear gunshots? Was there bad blood between the dead man and anyone in town? The process was surprisingly thorough, considering most participants had never investigated anything more complex than a missing chicken. Witness statements formed the backbone of most investigations. Unlike today's formal police interviews, these conversations happened wherever people felt comfortable talking. The saloon, the general store, even the church steps became impromptu interrogation rooms. Someone would pull out paper and pencil, and neighbors would share what they saw or heard. The weird part is how honest most witnesses were. In small communities, lying was risky business. Everyone knew everyone else, and getting caught in a fib could ruin your reputation permanently. Plus, there was genuine desire to find the truth. When violence struck these tight-knit settlements, it threatened everyone's sense of safety. Tracking suspects required a different approach entirely. Towns would quickly organize posses, groups of volunteer riders who'd chase criminals across the plains. These weren't highly trained manhunters. They were regular guys with horses, guns, and a sense of civic duty. The sheriff or marshal would deputize them on the spot, giving them legal authority to make arrests. Following tracks across open country was actually easier than you might think. Horses leave distinctive hoofprints, and experienced frontiersmen could read the ground like a book. They'd notice if a rider was moving fast, carrying extra weight, or favoring one leg. Some trackers could estimate how long ago someone had passed just by examining disturbed grass or scattered rocks. Then there's the challenge of mistaken identity. Without photographs or detailed records, descriptions of suspects were often pretty vague. Medium height, dark hair, wearing a brown coat could fit half the men in 3 counties. More than one innocent traveler found himself facing an angry posse because he happened to match a rough description. False accusations were another headache. Personal grudges sometimes clouded judgment, and desperate communities occasionally rushed to blame outsiders or unpopular locals. The Chinese immigrants faced particular suspicion, as did drifters and anyone who couldn't account for their whereabouts during a crime. Smart investigators learned to look beyond the obvious suspects. They'd check alibis carefully, examine physical evidence, and pay attention to who seemed too eager to point fingers. Some frontier lawmen developed impressive deductive skills through pure necessity and experience. Physical evidence played a bigger role than Hollywood westerns suggest. Bullet holes told stories about shooter positions and weapon types. Footprints revealed whether someone ran or walked calmly. Missing items from stores or homes helped establish motives. Blood spatters, though nobody understood them scientifically, still provided clues about what happened where. Communication between towns made investigations more complex, but also more effective. If a suspect fled to the next settlement, word would travel via telegraph or messenger. Neighboring sheriffs cooperated surprisingly well, sharing information and coordinating searches across county lines. The whole process moved much faster than modern investigations. There was pressure to resolve crimes quickly before trails went cold or suspects escaped too far. Justice felt immediate and personal because everyone involved lived in the same small community. But this speed came with costs. Sometimes investigations wrapped up too quickly, missing important details or rushing to judgment. The absence of professional training meant crucial evidence might be overlooked or contaminated. Still, these amateur investigators solved most crimes through determination, local knowledge, and community cooperation. Once they caught their suspect and gathered their evidence, the next challenge began: what to do with the accused while waiting for justice. That's where the town's makeshift jails and creative punishment systems came into play. Most Wild West towns had a problem. What do you do with criminals when there's nowhere to put them? The answer was usually a small wooden building that barely qualified as a jail. These lockups were often hastily built structures that looked more like storage sheds than proper detention centers. Some were so flimsy that determined prisoners could kick their way out if they really wanted to. Building a jail wasn't exactly rocket science, but it wasn't cheap either. Towns had to balance their need for security with their limited budgets. The result? Many early jails were simple wooden boxes with iron bars over the windows and a heavy door. Some didn't even have roofs, just 4 walls, and hope that prisoners wouldn't try to climb out. The fancier establishments might have 2 cells, allowing them to separate different types of offenders or keep men and women apart. But here's the thing about Wild West justice. It was fast. Really fast. Most people thrown in jail weren't there for long sentences. A drunk cowboy might spend a night cooling off after a bar fight. Someone caught stealing could face a few days behind bars plus a fine. The whole point was to make the punishment quick and visible so everyone in town got the message. Then there were the serious crimes. Murder, horse theft, or major robberies required different handling. These suspects often sat in jail for weeks or months waiting for a traveling judge to arrive. During this time, the town had to feed them, guard them, and hope they didn't escape. Some prisoners became local celebrities of sorts, with curious townspeople stopping by to get a look at the dangerous criminal in their midst. Hard labor was popular for non-violent crimes. Why let someone sit around eating your food when they could be fixing roads, cleaning up the town, or helping with construction projects? This approach served 2 purposes: punishment and community improvement. A thief might spend his sentence repairing the very building he tried to rob. Makes sense, right? Fines were even more practical. Money was always tight in frontier towns, so collecting cash from lawbreakers helped fund local improvements. The beauty of fines was that they hurt without requiring long-term housing. Pay your debt to society in dollars rather than days. Of course, this system worked better for people who actually had money to pay. Let's not forget the creative punishments. Some towns used public humiliation as effectively as jail time. A cheating card player might be forced to wear a sign advertising his crimes while walking through town. Public whippings, though brutal by today's standards, were considered merciful compared to hanging. They were also quick, cheap, and sent a clear message to potential troublemakers. The real challenge came with repeat offenders. What do you do with someone who keeps coming back? Most towns didn't have the resources for long-term imprisonment, and they certainly didn't want to keep feeding the same criminals over and over. The solution was often simple: run them out of town. Pack your bags, hit the trail, and don't come back. Ever. This exile system had an obvious flaw. The troublemaker you kicked out might just become the next town's problem. Some criminals made careers of drifting from place to place, staying one step ahead of their reputations. But for small communities with limited options, it was better than the alternatives. Escape attempts were surprisingly rare, partly because there wasn't always somewhere to go. The nearest town might be days away across dangerous territory. Plus, many prisoners knew their situations were temporary. Why risk getting shot trying to escape when you might be released next week? Women prisoners presented special challenges. Most jails weren't designed with separate facilities for female offenders, and social customs demanded different treatment. Some towns housed female prisoners in private homes under guard rather than in the regular lockup. Others simply had no idea what to do, and hoped the problem wouldn't come up often. The weird part is how casual some of these arrangements became. Prisoners might be allowed to work during the day and return to jail at night. Others earned privileges, like better food or visits from family. In small communities where everyone knew everyone, even criminals remained part of the social fabric to some degree. Winter presented its own problems. Wooden jails were cold, drafty, and sometimes dangerous. Prisoners could freeze to death if the town didn't provide adequate heat and blankets. Some sheriffs found themselves playing nursemaid to sick or injured prisoners, adding another layer to an already complicated job. As towns grew and prospered, their justice systems evolved too. Larger communities built better jails with multiple cells, proper heating and more secure construction. But in the early days, the whole system ran on improvisation and hope. While prisoners dealt with basic accommodations and quick punishments, their fate ultimately rested with another crucial part of frontier justice: the traveling judges who brought official legal authority to these scattered communities. Picture a dusty town with no courthouse. No fancy building with marble columns or polished wooden benches. Just a saloon, maybe a general store, and definitely a need for justice. When serious crimes happened in Wild West towns, there was one big problem: no permanent judge lived there to handle the trials. The solution? Traveling judges who rode from town to town like Old West postal workers, except they carried law books instead of letters. These circuit court judges covered enormous territories. A single judge might be responsible for dozens of towns scattered across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain. They traveled by horseback, wagon, or whatever transportation they could manage. The journey between towns could take days or even weeks, depending on weather, road conditions, and whether their horse decided to cooperate that morning. When a judge finally arrived in town, it was like a traveling circus, except instead of elephants and acrobats, people got legal proceedings and hopefully some justice. The whole community knew court was coming to town because word spread fast in small settlements where everyone knew everyone else's business. But here's where things got interesting. There was no courthouse in most of these places, so court happened wherever space allowed. Saloons were popular choices because they had large rooms and plenty of chairs. Sometimes court convened in schoolhouses, general stores, or even outdoors under trees if the weather was nice. One judge in Kansas reportedly held trials in a barn because it was the only building big enough to fit everyone. The makeshift courtrooms created some pretty memorable scenes. Imagine trying to conduct a serious murder trial while the bartender stacks glasses in the background or a cow moos outside the barn door, yet somehow justice moved forward. Finding a jury presented another challenge entirely. In big cities, courts could select from thousands of potential jurors. In tiny frontier towns, the jury pool might consist of whoever happened to be in town that day. The local blacksmith, a traveling salesman, 3 farmers and maybe the guy who runs the general store. Congratulations, you're now responsible for deciding someone's fate. These juries took their duties seriously despite the unusual circumstances. They listened to evidence, asked questions and deliberated just like their big city counterparts. The difference was, the jurors often knew the accused personally. Small towns made anonymous justice nearly impossible. Lawyers were about as rare as honest poker games in these proceedings. Most defendants represented themselves because no trained attorneys lived within hundreds of miles. Sometimes the local school teacher or store owner with decent speaking skills volunteered to help with legal arguments. Other times, people just stood up and told their side of the story in their own words. The lack of legal representation actually made trials more straightforward in some ways. No lengthy legal arguments about technicalities or procedural issues. Just witnesses, evidence and common sense applied to the situation. These trials moved faster than modern court cases. Though not always more fairly, delays were incredibly common and frustrating. A judge might promise to arrive in March, but not show up until July due to weather, other urgent cases, or simple travel difficulties. Meanwhile, accused criminals sat in those tiny wooden jails for months, and victims waited for justice that seemed to crawl across the prairie at wagon speed. Some towns got creative about these delays. They appointed local justices of the peace to handle minor disputes and simple cases. These weren't trained judges, usually just respected community members who could read and write well enough to keep records. They handled property disputes, small thefts and public drunkenness while saving the serious crimes for the real judge's eventual arrival. The traveling judges themselves were quite a mixed bunch. Some had proper legal training from Eastern law schools. Others had learned law through apprenticeships or simply by reading legal books and declaring themselves qualified. A few were excellent jurists who brought real justice to remote areas. Others were barely more qualified than the local saloon keeper to make legal decisions. Then there's the matter of legal precedent and consistency. When judges only visited every few months and covered such vast territories, keeping legal decisions uniform across different towns proved nearly impossible. What got you 5 years in prison in one town might earn you a $50 fine in the next county over, depending on which judge you faced and what kind of mood he was in. Weather played a huge role in frontier justice timing. Harsh winters could delay trials by months. Spring floods made roads impassable. Summer heat exhausted both horses and humans during long journeys between towns. Justice literally moved at the speed of the seasons. Despite all these challenges and irregularities, the circuit court system worked reasonably well for its time and place. It brought some semblance of official legal process to communities that otherwise relied entirely on vigilante justice or their own rough judgments. But while judges traveled from town to town handling the heavy legal lifting, something fascinating was happening in the wider world of frontier law enforcement. Stories of dramatic outlaws and daring robberies were starting to capture imaginations far beyond these small settlements. Stories about Wild West outlaws spread faster than wildfire across America. But here's what nobody tells you: most of these legendary criminals were about as successful as a chocolate teapot. The newspapers of the 1870s and 1880s had figured out something modern tabloids still use today: scary stories sell papers. A small-time horse thief who stole one mare could become a notorious gang leader terrorizing the frontier by the time his story reached readers back east. Take Jesse James, probably the most famous outlaw name you've ever heard. Sure, he robbed banks and trains, but his gang's biggest single haul was around $3,000, decent money for 1881, but hardly the fortune most people imagine. The James gang spent most of their time hiding in caves, dodging posers, and arguing about where to strike next. Glamorous? Not really. Most of their robberies netted them pocket change after splitting the loot multiple ways. Billy the Kid became a household name, but what did he actually accomplish? He allegedly killed 21 men, though historians now believe the real number was closer to 4. Billy spent his short career rustling cattle, picking fights, and getting into trouble over card games. His most famous showdowns were usually drunken brawls that escalated too quickly. The Kid died at 21, shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett while sneaking around in the dark. Not exactly the stuff of epic Western movies. Then there's the curious case of how these stories grew bigger with each telling. A stagecoach robbery involving 2 masked men and $47 in stolen coins would transform into an epic tale of a dozen outlaws making off with thousands in gold. Newspaper editors knew their readers craved excitement. especially folks stuck in boring factory jobs back in Chicago or New York. Why let facts ruin a perfectly good yarn? Most train robberies were disasters for the criminals involved. Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch pulled off maybe a dozen successful heists over several years, but they spent far more time running from the law than enjoying their spoils. Train cars were often nearly empty, passengers carried little cash, and the real valuable cargo was usually too heavy to steal quickly. Robbing a train meant dealing with armed guards, angry passengers, and telegraph operators who could summon help within hours. But newspapers didn't want to report that the infamous hole-in-the-wall gang once rode 50 miles through harsh weather, only to discover their target train was carrying lumber and farm equipment. Boring stories don't sell papers or create legends. Editors needed heroes and villains, dramatic shootouts, and daring escapes. The truth that most outlaws were poorly organized, frequently drunk and often hungry, just didn't capture readers' imaginations. Bank robberies were even rarer than people think. Between 1859 and 1900, historians count fewer than 10 successful bank heists across the entire American frontier. Most frontier towns didn't even have banks worth robbing. The local bank might be a strongbox in the general store or a small safe in someone's house. Breaking into these places required more luck than skill, and the payoff was usually disappointing. What's really wild is how outlaws became folk heroes while they were still alive and causing trouble. Jesse James read newspaper articles about his own crimes, often laughing at the exaggerated details. Some outlaws started writing letters to editors, correcting facts about their exploits or bragging about jobs they hadn't actually pulled off yet. Criminal publicity had become a strange kind of career move. The gap between legend and reality gets even wider when you look at actual outlaw behavior. Most spent their time doing incredibly mundane things, mending clothes, cooking beans over campfires, and hiding in uncomfortable places. Butch Cassidy worked as a ranch hand between crimes. The Sundance Kid was reportedly excellent at laundry. These weren't the romantic figures of dime novels and later Hollywood films. Local lawmen knew the truth but couldn't compete with exciting newspaper stories. A sheriff who caught horse thieves after a boring 3-day investigation didn't make headlines. But that same capture could become a thrilling pursuit across dangerous territory, ending in a blazing gunfight once the story reached distant readers. Reality was too slow, too ordinary, and frankly too sensible for good entertainment. Small-town editors sometimes invented outlaw gangs entirely, creating fictional criminals to explain any unsolved crimes or mysterious events in their area. Missing cattle must be the work of the Shadow Ridge Gang. Broken store window. Obviously those midnight riders struck again. Readers hundreds of miles away had no way to verify these stories, so imagination filled the gaps. The real outlaws were usually broke, scared, and looking for ways to quit their dangerous lifestyle. Many tried going straight but found their reputations made normal employment nearly impossible. Once you're labeled a notorious criminal in the newspapers, convincing people you want to become a peaceful shopkeeper gets pretty challenging. All this media attention created something unexpected though. It influenced how real criminals started behaving, and that's where things get really interesting. Crime in the Wild West had an unwritten rule that modern folks might find surprising. Women weren't just innocent bystanders watching from behind lace curtains. They ran businesses, made tough decisions, and sometimes found themselves on both sides of the law. The frontier didn't have time for delicate flowers who couldn't handle themselves. Saloon keepers were among the toughest business owners in any Wild West town. Many of them happened to be women. These weren't quiet tea party hosts. They managed rowdy crowds, handled large amounts of cash, and kept order when cowboys got too drunk or card games went bad. A saloon owner named Mary Johnson in Deadwood once threw 3 armed men out of her establishment, using nothing but a wooden bat and some very colorful language. She didn't call for the sheriff, she handled it herself. Female criminals did exist, though they were much rarer than their male counterparts. Some women turned to theft when their husbands died and left them with nothing. Others got involved in more serious crimes like cattle rustling or even murder. Pearl Hart became famous for robbing a stagecoach in Arizona in 1899. She dressed like a man, held up the coach with her partner, and made off with about $400. The weird part is she got caught because she stopped to help the passengers she'd just robbed when their stagecoach broke down. But here's where things got really interesting. Some women didn't just commit crimes, they helped stop them. Belle Starr might be remembered as an outlaw queen, but plenty of other women joined vigilante groups or helped track down criminals. When a gang of horse thieves terrorized a Colorado town in 1882, 3 local women rode with the posse that caught them. They knew the terrain, could shoot straight, and weren't about to let criminals destroy their community. The justice system had a problem when it came to female criminals. Most jails weren't built with women in mind. Towns that barely had enough money for a wooden lockup certainly couldn't afford separate facilities. When women did get arrested, sheriffs often had to get creative. Some female prisoners got locked in hotel rooms with guards posted outside. Others were kept in the sheriff's own home, with his wife serving as an unofficial jailer. Makes sense, right? Towns couldn't just ignore female criminals, but they also couldn't throw women into cells with male prisoners. The solution was usually temporary and improvised. A woman caught stealing might spend her sentence doing laundry or cleaning for local families instead of sitting in jail. This wasn't necessarily kindness, it was practical problem solving. Society expected women to be the moral backbone of their communities. While men might settle disputes with fists or guns, women were supposed to use reason and religious values to keep peace. Many did exactly that. Women organized church groups, ran schools, and created social clubs that gave people alternatives to spending all their time in saloons. When tensions rose between different ethnic groups, women often stepped in to calm things down before violence erupted. Then there were the women who took more direct action. Some frontier women carried guns and knew how to use them. They had to. When your nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away and the sheriff might be 3 towns over, you couldn't count on someone else to protect your family. Women defended their homes against raiders, fought off wild animals, and sometimes had shootouts with outlaws. They just didn't brag about it in newspapers the way men did. Female business owners faced unique challenges that could push them toward illegal activities. Banks rarely gave loans to women. Suppliers sometimes refused to deal with female shop owners. When legal options were limited, some women bent the rules. They might sell liquor without licenses, run gambling games in the back rooms of their stores, or trade in stolen goods. These weren't career criminals. They were people trying to survive in a system that made legal success nearly impossible. Children complicated everything when it came to women and crime. A woman with kids couldn't just disappear into the wilderness like male outlaws did. If she got arrested, what happened to her children? Towns had to figure this out case by case. Sometimes relatives took the kids, other times the whole community pitched in to care for them. A few women escaped serious punishment simply because no one knew what to do with their children if mom went to jail. The strangest cases involved women who pretended to be men to commit crimes or avoid capture. Some got away with it for months before anyone caught on. Others used their feminine appearance to trick victims, then revealed they were armed and dangerous. Criminals adapted to whatever advantages they had. Law enforcement slowly learned to deal with female criminals and witnesses. Some towns appointed women as unofficial deputies to handle situations involving other women. These weren't armed officers, but they could search female suspects, interview women who'd witnessed crimes, and help maintain order in ways that male lawmen couldn't. While adults figured out crime and punishment, another group was quietly watching and learning from everything they saw. The children of the Wild West had their own relationship with law and order that would surprise most people today. Children in Wild West towns lived very different lives than kids today. Most boys and girls started working before they turned 10 years old. They helped on family farms, ran messages between businesses, and swept floors in general stores. The idea of childhood as a time for play and school, that luxury didn't exist for most frontier families who needed every pair of hands to survive. Juvenile crime was almost unheard of in these communities. Why? Kids were too busy working to get into serious trouble. A boy might sneak an apple from the mercantile or skip out on chores, but these weren't crimes that brought the sheriff running. Parents handled discipline with a firm hand and swift punishment. The community expected it. Then there were the orphaned children, and there were plenty of them. Disease, accidents, and violence left many kids without parents. Some towns developed informal systems to care for these abandoned youngsters. Families would take in extra children, not through any official adoption process, but because someone had to feed them. These arrangements weren't always kind, and some kids ended up as unpaid servants rather than family members. Boys often got involved in law enforcement activities, though not in ways you might expect. When possess formed to chase cattle rustlers or track down criminals, teenage boys sometimes joined the group. They held horses, carried supplies, or rode messages between searchers. The sheriff might deputize a reliable 15-year-old for special tasks. It wasn't unusual to see boys helping with arrests or guarding prisoners. But here's where things get interesting. Some children did form gangs, especially in larger settlements like Dodge City or Deadwood. These weren't dangerous criminal organizations plotting bank robberies. They were more like groups of homeless kids banding together for protection and survival. They might steal food when hungry, or break into abandoned buildings for shelter during winter months. The weird part is how towns dealt with young troublemakers. Most places had no juvenile justice system, no special courts for children, no reform schools. If a kid committed a crime serious enough to warrant official attention, they faced the same consequences as adults. A 12-year-old caught stealing cattle could theoretically hang alongside grown men. Let's not forget that children often witnessed the rougher sides of frontier justice. They saw public whippings, watched criminals get run out of town, and sometimes attended hangings that drew crowds like county fairs. These events were considered educational, teaching kids about the consequences of breaking the law. Modern parents would be horrified, but frontier families viewed it as practical moral instruction. Schools existed in some towns, but attendance was spotty. Children went to class when farm work allowed, and when families could afford to lose their labor. Teachers were often young women barely older than their oldest students. Discipline in these one-room schoolhouses could be harsh, with rulers across knuckles and dunce caps for slow learners. But schools also taught respect for law and order, drilling students on civic duty and proper behavior. Children also served as informal news networks in small communities. Kids ran messages between houses, carried gossip, and reported suspicious activities to adults. They knew which stranger had ridden into town, which families were having money troubles, and where the best hiding spots were located. Smart lawmen cultivated relationships with local children, who could provide valuable information about criminal activities. Some towns developed unique ways to handle problem children. Rather than jail time, young offenders might be sentenced to work for the church, help the doctor, or assist the school teacher. Community service existed long before it became an official legal concept. This approach kept kids productive while teaching them valuable skills. The absence of organized youth activities meant children created their own entertainment, and sometimes this led to minor mischief. Boys might race horses through town streets, accidentally damage property, or start fights that required adult intervention. Girls could get into trouble for gambling, though their games usually involved buttons or candy rather than money. What's surprising is how seriously frontier communities took the welfare of all children, not just their own. A child wandering alone would be taken in, fed, and questioned about their circumstances. Towns couldn't afford to have desperate, hungry kids roaming around causing problems. Better to address the situation before it escalated into criminal behavior. Children learned adult responsibilities early, because frontier life demanded it. A 10-year-old might handle firearms, manage livestock, or negotiate business deals at the general store. This early maturity meant fewer behavioral problems, but also fewer protections when things went wrong. The reality was that most Wild West children were too tired from daily work to cause serious trouble. They fell into bed exhausted each night, rose before dawn for chores, and spent their days contributing to family survival. Crime was a luxury they couldn't afford. While kids learned to be self-reliant and responsible, the justice system wasn't always equipped to handle the few who did step out of line. Understanding how frontier communities managed their youngest members reveals something important about how law and order developed in these remote settlements, especially when it came to protecting valuable property. Stealing a man's horse in the Wild West wasn't just theft, it was basically a death sentence handed to the victim. Out on the frontier, your horse meant everything. Transportation, escape from danger, survival itself. Take someone's horse, and you might as well be pointing a gun at their head. That's why horse theft carried the harshest penalties short of murder. Cattle rustling ran a close second in the serious crime department. Ranchers invested everything they had in their herds. Losing 50 head of cattle to thieves could bankrupt a family overnight. The financial blow hit harder than most bank robberies, which rarely netted more than a few $100s anyway. But here's what made these crimes particularly tricky. The sheer scale of the landscape worked in the criminals' favor. Rustlers operated under cover of darkness, across thousands of acres of open range. They'd strike fast, drive stolen cattle for days across unmarked territory, and disappear into the next county before anyone noticed the missing livestock. Well-organized gangs sometimes altered brands with running irons, essentially giving stolen cattle new identities. The most successful rustlers weren't wild-eyed desperados shooting up towns. They were calculating businessmen who understood the cattle market. Some posed as legitimate cattle buyers, purchasing small herds with forged papers or stolen money. Others worked the system from the inside, bribing ranch hands or getting jobs as cowhands to learn herd movements and security weak points. Horse thieves faced different challenges but used similar tactics. A good horse was worth more than most people earned in months, making them irresistible targets. Thieves preferred stealing horses from remote ranches or catching them during river crossings when herds were scattered. Quick getaways meant everything. Stolen horses could be sold at distant markets within days. Then there's the problem every lawman faced when chasing these criminals. Jurisdiction meant almost nothing across vast frontier distances. A rustler could steal cattle in Texas, drive them through New Mexico territory, and sell them in Colorado. Which sheriff had authority? Which court would try the case? Criminals exploited these legal gray areas ruthlessly. Most posses chasing rustlers weren't official law enforcement at all. Ranchers formed their own pursuit groups, sometimes spending weeks tracking thieves across multiple territories. These civilian posses operated with a rough frontier justice that didn't worry much about proper arrest procedures. When they caught rustlers red-handed with stolen livestock, trials were often brief affairs held around campfires. The weird part is how some communities handled the evidence problem. Proving cattle theft wasn't always straightforward, especially when brands had been altered. Experienced cattlemen could spot a doctored brand, but legal proof required more than suspicion. Smart rustlers knew this, sometimes boldly returning to areas where they'd previously operated, counting on the difficulty of building solid cases against them. Professional cattle detectives eventually emerged as the problem grew worse. Stock associations hired these specialists to track down thieves and recover stolen herds. These detectives were part investigator, part tracker, and part gunfighter. They'd follow cold trails for months, building cases that could hold up in territorial courts. But catching rustlers was only half the battle. Punishment had to be severe enough to deter others from trying the same crimes. Hanging became the standard sentence for repeat offenders, and everyone knew it. First-time horse thieves might get prison time if they were lucky and local juries felt merciful. Second-time offenders rarely saw the inside of a jail cell. They usually met the business end of a rope. Some of the most notorious rustling operations involved hundreds of cattle and dozens of participants. The stakes were enormous. A successful cattle theft could net the equivalent of several years' wages for working cowboys. That kind of money attracted dangerous people willing to kill anyone who got in their way. Local ranchers developed counter-strategies that would seem extreme by today's standards. They hired armed guards to ride with valuable herds. Some ranchers employed their own detectives to infiltrate suspected rustling gangs. Brand inspectors checked cattle sales at major markets, looking for livestock that didn't belong to the sellers. What's surprising is how organized some of these criminal enterprises became. Large rustling gangs operated like businesses, with leaders, territories, and regular customers who bought stolen livestock with few questions asked. They maintained networks of corrupt buyers, crooked brand inspectors, and dishonest transportation companies. The cat-and-mouse game between rustlers and ranchers shaped frontier law enforcement in ways that lasted for decades. Stock associations gained political influence, pushing for stronger anti-theft laws and better funding for law enforcement in rural areas. Of course, not every accused rustler was actually guilty. Frontier justice sometimes moved faster than frontier evidence gathering. Mistaken identity, disputed ownership, and personal vendettas occasionally sent innocent people to early graves. But as legal systems matured and became more sophisticated, these tragic errors became less common. Speaking of legal sophistication, the gambling halls and saloons that dotted every frontier town presented their own unique challenges for maintaining law and order. Picture a typical Wild West saloon and your mind probably jumps to swinging doors, piano music, and cowboys throwing back shots of whiskey. Well, you're not entirely wrong. Saloons were the heartbeat of most frontier towns, serving as social clubs, business centers, and yes, the primary source of local crime reports. These establishments weren't just about drinking. They functioned as informal town halls where men gathered to discuss politics, trade cattle, plan business ventures, and catch up on gossip. But here's the thing about mixing alcohol, gambling, and strangers carrying weapons. Trouble had a way of brewing faster than the coffee. Most saloon-related crimes fell into predictable categories. Card cheats topped the list, and for good reason. Professional gamblers drifted from town to town, setting up games with marked decks or loaded dice. Local cowboys, miners, and farmers who'd worked months for their pay could lose everything in a single evening to a smooth-talking stranger. When someone discovered they'd been swindled, fists flew first and questions came later. Then there were the garden variety drunk brawlers. Payday brought the worst of it. Cowboys finishing long cattle drives would hit town with months of wages burning holes in their pockets. Miners emerging from weeks underground craved entertainment and companionship. Farmers celebrating successful harvests wanted to blow off steam. Mix exhaustion, alcohol, and pent-up frustration, and you've got a recipe for broken furniture and black eyes. Violence escalated near major events too. When cattle drives converged on towns like Dodge City or Abilene, the population could triple overnight. Suddenly, establishments that normally served 50 regulars were packed with 300 strangers. Tempers ran short, misunderstandings multiplied, and what started as playful ribbing between Texas cowboys and Kansas locals could explode into full-scale brawls. But here's what's interesting: most saloon owners weren't passive observers of this chaos. They hired bouncers, tough men whose job was keeping order without involving the town marshal. These weren't necessarily big, intimidating giants either. Many were former soldiers or experienced frontiersmen who understood how to defuse situations before they spiraled out of control. Smart saloon keepers developed their own house rules. Some banned weapons at the door, requiring patrons to check guns with the bartender. Others employed dealers they trusted to run honest games, knowing that word of crooked gambling would eventually drive away customers. Many established credit limits to prevent desperate men from betting away their family's survival money. The weird part is how some towns handled their saloon problems. Rather than accepting the chaos, several communities simply banned alcohol sales entirely. These dry towns pushed drinking establishments outside city limits, creating odd situations where men would ride miles for a beer, then return home potentially more dangerous than if they'd just walked down Main Street. Other towns took a regulatory approach. They issued expensive licenses that limited the number of saloons, figuring fewer establishments meant easier oversight. Some communities restricted operating hours, forbidding alcohol sales on Sundays or after certain evening hours. A few progressive towns even required saloon owners to post bonds, money they'd forfeit if their establishments became too troublesome. Law enforcement's relationship with saloons was complicated. Town marshals knew exactly where to find troublemakers, making their job easier in some ways. Bartenders often served as informal deputies, reporting suspicious characters or planned crimes. Many saloon owners had legitimate interests in maintaining order, since repeated violence scared away paying customers. But let's not forget the economic reality. Saloons generated significant tax revenue for struggling frontier communities. They employed bartenders, dealers, musicians, and cleaning staff. They purchased supplies from local merchants and often served the only hot meals available in small towns. Shutting them down entirely could cripple a settlement's economy. The most serious saloon crimes involved robbery and murder, though these remained relatively rare. Desperate men sometimes held up establishments during busy nights, knowing patrons carried cash for gambling. Occasionally, cheating accusations led to deadly shootouts. Personal grudges that started elsewhere frequently ended in saloon confrontations, since these were among the few places men regularly gathered. What's fascinating is how quickly saloon culture evolved as towns matured. Early establishments were often crude affairs, a plank across two barrels serving as a bar, with gambling happening on overturned crates. As communities grew, saloons became more sophisticated. They featured elaborate bars shipped from eastern cities, professional entertainment, and even crude restaurants. Some saloon keepers became respected community leaders. They organized charity drives, sponsored local events, and mediated disputes between customers. Others remained on society's margins, catering to the roughest elements and constantly battling local authorities. The cyclical nature of saloon violence created predictable patterns that experienced lawmen learned to anticipate. They knew which nights would bring trouble, which combinations of visitors spelled disaster, and which establishments required extra attention. But even as saloons generated most small-town crime reports, remember that the real money, and the crimes that captured newspaper headlines, happened elsewhere. Banks and stagecoaches carried the wealth that attracted professional criminals. Money in the Wild West wasn't like today. No credit cards, no banks on every corner, and definitely no ATMs. Most people dealt in hard cash, gold dust, or simple bartering. Towns might have one bank if they were lucky, and that made those few banks incredibly tempting targets for desperate men with guns. But here's the thing that Hollywood got completely wrong. Bank robberies weren't happening every other Tuesday like in the movies. Between 1859 and 1900, fewer than 10 successful bank robberies occurred across the entire American frontier. 10, that's less than one every 4 years across thousands of miles of territory. Makes you wonder why we think every outlaw spent their days planning the next big heist, right? The real action happened on the roads, not in town squares. Stagecoach lines crisscrossed the west like arteries, carrying everything valuable from one settlement to another. Gold from California mines, payroll for railroad workers, mail from families back east, and sometimes just the life savings of hopeful settlers moving to their next opportunity. These coaches represented moving treasure chests rolling across empty plains with minimal protection. Wells Fargo became the king of stagecoach transportation, and their green strongboxes became legendary targets. The company hired armed guards called shotgun messengers, who rode beside drivers, scanning the horizon for trouble. That's where we get the phrase riding shotgun today. These guards carried double-barreled shotguns loaded with buckshot, perfect for close-range encounters with highway robbers. Most stagecoach robberies followed a predictable pattern. Bandits picked isolated stretches of road, often near steep hills where coaches had to slow down. They'd block the path with fallen trees or rocks, then emerge from hiding with bandanas over their faces and guns drawn. The famous shout, "Stand and deliver," wasn't just movie dialogue. It was the real command that froze blood in travelers' veins. Then there's the surprising truth about what robbers actually found. Those legendary tales of stagecoaches loaded with thousands in gold. Pure fiction most of the time. The average haul from a stagecoach robbery was maybe $50 to $100, split among several bandits. After weeks of planning and the risk of hanging if caught, many outlaws walked away with less money than a ranch hand made in a month. Smart stagecoach companies developed clever tricks to fool robbers. They used decoy strongboxes filled with rocks while hiding real valuables in secret compartments. Some coaches carried fake treasure maps or planted stories about valuable shipments on different routes entirely. While Wells Fargo even hired detectives who posed as ordinary passengers, ready to surprise would-be robbers with hidden weapons. The most famous stagecoach robber was probably Charles Bowles, better known as Black Bart. This guy had style. He left polite poems at robbery scenes and never fired a shot during his 8-year career. His signature verse read, "I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches." Poetry and crime don't usually mix, but Black Bart made it work. When banks did get robbed, the whole territory took notice. News traveled fast because bank robberies meant someone had attacked the financial heart of a community. Every merchant, rancher and settler who kept money in that bank suddenly faced potential ruin. Towns would form massive posses, sometimes hundreds of men strong, to hunt down bank robbers with fury that surprised even hardened outlaws. Bank security in frontier towns was pretty basic by today's standards. Most banks were just regular buildings with a safe in the back room and maybe 1 or 2 employees. No cameras, no silent alarms, no bulletproof glass. The main security was the fact that everyone in town knew everyone else's business. A stranger casing a bank would stick out like a sore thumb, and word would spread quickly. The legendary James Gang pulled off some of the most famous bank jobs, but even they targeted banks carefully. They studied small towns for weeks, learning guard schedules, escape routes, and when the most money would be available. Jesse James wasn't just some wild gunslinger. He was a calculating criminal who planned every detail. His gang's success came from preparation, not just firepower. Railroad payrolls created another tempting target. Construction crews needed regular cash payments, often delivered by train to remote work sites. Smart outlaws learned train schedules and hit these shipments in isolated areas where help was hours away. But railroad companies fought back hard, hiring Pinkerton detectives and armed guards who turned some robbery attempts into running gun battles. What really protected most frontier money wasn't fancy security systems or armies of guards. It was distance, unpredictability, and the simple fact that most cash moved in small amounts spread across many different routes. Robbers never knew which stagecoach or train actually carried significant money, making their crimes more like expensive gambling than guaranteed paydays. But the real question isn't how often these robberies happened or how much money changed hands. The bigger issue is what all this highway banditry meant for regular folks trying to build lives in an already dangerous wilderness. Wild West towns didn't stay wild forever. Most people wanted their communities to grow beyond dusty streets and makeshift justice. As settlements expanded and more families arrived, residents began pushing for real law systems that could handle complex problems and growing populations. The first step usually involved hiring more marshals. Early towns might have gotten by with one part-time lawman who also ran a store or farmed on weekends. But as populations swelled past a few hundred people, that system broke down fast. Citizens started demanding full-time officers who could patrol regularly and respond to trouble quickly. Some towns hired deputy marshals to cover different neighborhoods or work night shifts. Makes sense, right? You can't expect one person to watch over 1,000 people spread across miles of territory. Building bigger and better jails became another priority. Those tiny wooden lockups might have worked when the only criminals were drunk cowboys or occasional troublemakers, but growing towns needed space for more prisoners and longer sentences. Citizens voted to fund brick or stone jails with multiple cells, proper locks, and even separate areas for different types of offenders. Well, at least they tried to separate them when space allowed. Then there's the matter of courts. Waiting months for a traveling judge to show up worked when crimes were rare and simple, but busy towns needed regular court sessions to handle the backlog of cases. Communities petitioned territorial or state governments for permanent judges and official courthouses. They wanted trials held in proper buildings with witness stands and jury boxes, not in the back room of Murphy's saloon. Legal codes became more detailed as towns matured. Early settlements might have operated on basic rules like don't steal and don't shoot people. Growing communities needed written laws covering everything from noise complaints to property disputes to business regulations. Town councils spent hours debating ordinances about garbage disposal, animal control, and building standards. Citizens could finally know exactly what was legal and what wasn't because the rules were posted in public for everyone to read. Schools played a surprising role in building better law systems. Parents wanted their children educated about civic duty and respect for authority. Teachers included lessons about following laws and participating in democratic processes. Kids learned that laws existed to protect everyone, not just to punish troublemakers. This new generation grew up understanding that civilization required cooperation and compromise, not just individual toughness. Professional training for lawmen slowly replaced the old system of electing whoever seemed tough enough for the job. Some marshals traveled to larger cities to learn investigation techniques and proper arrest procedures. Others attended regional meetings where experienced officers shared strategies for handling different crimes. The days of pinning a badge on any volunteer were ending as communities demanded competent law enforcement. Communication improvements helped law systems work more effectively. Telegraph lines allowed marshals to contact neighboring towns about escaped criminals or stolen property. Railroad connections meant prisoners could be transferred to better facilities or court appearances in distant cities. Wanted posters and criminal descriptions spread faster between communities, making it harder for troublemakers to simply move to the next town and start fresh. Record keeping became more systematic as towns established permanent law systems. Early marshals might have kept notes on scraps of paper or relied on memory. Professional departments maintained detailed arrest records, court proceedings, and crime statistics. These records helped identify repeat offenders and track crime patterns across different seasons or neighborhoods. Citizen involvement evolved beyond the old vigilante committees into more organized community groups. Town watch associations worked with official lawmen to patrol streets and report suspicious activity. Business owners cooperated with marshals to prevent theft and maintain order during busy periods. Church groups and social clubs promoted moral behavior and supported families of crime victims. Let's not forget that funding these improvements required significant community investment. Better jails, full-time marshals, and permanent courts cost money that early settlements often lacked. Towns raised funds through taxes, fines, and sometimes special assessments on businesses that benefited most from improved law enforcement. Saloon owners and merchants usually paid extra fees since their establishments attracted the most trouble. The transition wasn't always smooth. Some old-timers resented new regulations and professional lawmen who didn't understand local customs. Conflicts arose between elected officials who wanted stricter enforcement and business owners who worried about scaring away customers. Balancing individual freedom with community safety remained a constant challenge as towns grew larger and more diverse. But the weird part is how quickly most Wild West towns embraced these changes once they started working. Murder rates dropped dramatically as professional law enforcement took hold. Property crimes decreased when criminals faced certain punishment in proper courts. Business flourished when visitors felt safe walking the streets day and night. These improvements didn't happen overnight, and they certainly weren't uniform across all communities. Some towns built sophisticated law systems within a few years while others struggled with basic order for decades. However, even the most remote mining camps would eventually face their own unique challenges when precious metals brought both fortune and chaos to previously quiet settlements. The moment someone yelled gold, everything changed. Within weeks, sleepy valleys turned into chaotic tent cities packed with thousands of fortune seekers. Mining camps sprouted like weeds after rain, appearing so fast that maps couldn't keep up. Towns that didn't exist on Monday had saloons, gambling halls and general stores by Friday. But here's what nobody tells you about those famous gold rushes. The real danger wasn't grizzly bears or claim jumpers, it was your neighbor. Take California's mining camps during the 1849 gold rush. Towns like Bodie and Hangtown recorded murder rates that would make modern Detroit look peaceful. We're talking about 150 murders per 100,000 people in some camps. Compare that to today's national average of about 5 per 100,000, and you start to understand just how wild things got when gold fever struck. Mining camps were basically recipe books for violence. First, you mixed thousands of strangers from different countries who couldn't speak each other's languages. Then you added the stress of backbreaking work for maybe nothing. Throw in the fact that some guys struck it rich while others went broke, and tensions exploded faster than dynamite in a mineshaft. The weird part is how disputes over gold claims turned ordinary farmers into potential killers. A boundary disagreement that might cost someone their life savings could literally mean the difference between wealth and poverty. When your claim might hold thousands of dollars in gold, moving a boundary marker 6 inches became worth fighting over, sometimes worth dying over. Then there's the complete lack of law enforcement. Most mining camps had 0 lawmen for their first months or even years. No sheriffs, no marshals, no courts. When your neighbor accused you of stealing gold from his claim, there wasn't exactly a police station to call. Miners had to figure out justice on their own, which usually meant the loudest voice or the fastest gun won the argument. Miners developed their own court systems out of pure necessity. These miners' courts weren't fancy legal proceedings, they were more like town hall meetings where everyone shouted their opinions. A typical miner's court might consist of whoever happened to be in the saloon that evening, with the bartender serving as judge. Evidence, whatever people claimed they saw, legal representation. Good luck with that. Let's not forget the incredible speed at which these camps appeared and disappeared. Unlike established towns with roots and relationships, mining camps were full of people who might pack up and leave tomorrow. Why worry about your reputation when you'll probably never see these people again? This temporary mentality made violence more likely, because long-term consequences seemed irrelevant. Alcohol made everything worse. Saloons were often the first businesses established in mining camps, sometimes before anyone built proper housing. After months of isolation, back-breaking work, and constant disappointment, miners would blow their earnings on whiskey and gambling. Mix alcohol with armed men arguing over money, and you've got a powder keg ready to explode. The demographics of mining camps created additional problems. Most miners were young men between 20 and 40, exactly the age group most likely to get into fights. Few women or families lived in early mining camps, which meant fewer voices of reason to calm heated situations. Without the stabilizing influence of families and established community leaders, conflicts escalated quickly. Chinese immigrants faced particularly brutal treatment during mining rushes. White miners often blamed them for taking jobs or finding gold in supposedly worked-out claims. Anti-Chinese violence was so common in some camps that entire Chinese settlements were burned down, or their residents forced to leave at gunpoint. The law rarely protected Chinese miners, even when local authorities existed. But why were mining camps so much more violent than regular frontier towns? The answer lies in what people were fighting over. In farming communities, disputes might involve land boundaries or cattle theft. Serious but not necessarily life-changing. In mining camps, every argument potentially involved fortunes. A single gold nugget could be worth months of wages, making theft and claim jumping incredibly tempting. Some mining camps recorded several murders per week during their peak periods. Virginia City, Nevada, reportedly had a murder every single day for a stretch during the Comstock Silver Rush. Deadwood, South Dakota, lived up to its name with frequent shootings and stabbings during its gold boom years. Mining camp justice was swift and brutal. Hanging was the preferred punishment for serious crimes, partly because camps rarely had jails and couldn't afford to feed prisoners. Many camps built gallows before they built churches. The threat of immediate execution was supposed to deter crime, but desperate men chasing gold often ignored the risks. As mining camps grew into real towns, violence typically decreased. Permanent residents arrived. Families moved in, and legitimate businesses replaced get-rich-quick schemes. But those early months and years, They were absolutely the bloodiest chapter of Wild West crime. Speaking of how communities evolved beyond these chaotic beginnings, the West's diverse population created entirely different kinds of tensions that would reshape frontier justice in unexpected ways. The Wild West wasn't just about cowboys and outlaws. Different groups of people lived side by side in these frontier towns, and that created some serious problems. Chinese immigrants, African Americans, Mexican families and white settlers all tried to make their way in the same dusty streets. Sometimes it worked out fine, other times, well, things got ugly fast. Chinese immigrants faced some of the worst treatment. They'd come to America to build the railroads and work in the mines, but once those jobs were done, many white settlers didn't want them sticking around. Towns passed laws specifically targeting Chinese people. Some places banned them from owning mining claims. Others wouldn't let them testify in court against white people. Can you imagine trying to get justice when the law says your word doesn't count? Then there's the bizarre part about laundry. Chinese immigrants often started laundry businesses because it was one of the few jobs they could get. But some towns passed laws saying you couldn't operate a laundry without expensive permits that somehow only got denied to Chinese applicants. Subtle, right? African Americans who moved west after the Civil War thought they'd left the worst racism behind in the South. Many had, but they still ran into plenty of trouble. Some all-black towns like Nicodemus in Kansas tried to create their own safe spaces. But when black settlers mixed with white communities, tensions flared up. Black cowboys worked the same cattle drives as white cowboys, yet they often couldn't eat in the same restaurants or stay in the same hotels when they reached town. Violence sometimes erupted during what people called race riots. These weren't really riots at all. They were more like organized attacks by white mobs against minority communities. In 1885, white miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming, attacked Chinese workers, killing 28 people and driving hundreds more out of town. The Chinese workers had been brought in by the railroad company, but when jobs got scarce, they became convenient scapegoats. Mexican families faced their own set of problems, especially in places like Texas and California, where the border had recently shifted. People who'd been living on their land for generations suddenly found themselves foreigners in their own hometown. Land disputes got messy fast. Some Mexican landowners lost their property to legal tricks they couldn't navigate because they didn't speak English or understand American court systems. But here's what's interesting. Some frontier communities figured out how to make diversity work. Towns with Spanish-speaking populations sometimes hired bilingual sheriffs who could talk to everyone. These lawmen became bridges between different groups, translating not just language but cultural misunderstandings that might otherwise explode into violence. Native American tribes dealt with the most systematic violence of all. As settlers pushed west, they took land that tribes had lived on for centuries. The conflicts that followed weren't really crime in the usual sense. They were more like small wars over territory. When Native Americans raided settlements or attacked wagon trains, settlers called it crime. When the US Army burned native villages or forced tribes onto reservations, officials called it law enforcement. Funny how perspective works. Some towns tried to prevent ethnic violence before it started. Community leaders organized meetings where different groups could air their grievances instead of letting anger build up. Churches sometimes played peacekeeper roles, reminding everyone that their various gods probably didn't approve of murder and mayhem. Laws themselves often made tensions worse. California passed a foreign miners tax that charged anyone who looked foreign extra fees to work gold claims. Guess who decided what counted as foreign? The same white miners who didn't want competition for the best spots. These discriminatory laws created a whole category of crimes that only applied to certain ethnic groups. Language barriers made everything more complicated. When someone got arrested and couldn't understand what they were accused of, fair trials became nearly impossible. Some prisoners sat in jail for weeks because nobody could explain the charges against them. A few smart sheriffs learned basic Spanish or Chinese phrases, but most lawmen just shrugged and hoped for the best. Economic competition fueled a lot of ethnic conflict. When times were good and there was work for everyone, different groups got along better. But when jobs dried up or gold claims played out, people started looking for someone to blame. Immigrants and minorities made easy targets because they often couldn't fight back effectively through legal channels. The weird part is how these tensions played out differently in different places. A Chinese merchant might face constant harassment in one town, but become a respected community leader just 50 miles away. Success often depended on timing, local leadership, and pure luck. Mixed communities that survived their early growing pains often became stronger and more peaceful over time. Kids who grew up playing together didn't carry the same prejudices as their parents. Intermarriage gradually blended some communities. Business partnerships between different ethnic groups created mutual interests in keeping the peace. These racial and ethnic tensions shaped how law enforcement developed across the West. The communities that learned to manage diversity effectively often became the most stable and prosperous towns, but the places that let hatred fester, they usually faced years of violence and instability that made normal life nearly impossible. Speaking of stability, religious institutions would soon step in to help calm these troubled waters. Crime and chaos weren't the only forces shaping Wild West communities. Religious leaders and churches played a surprisingly powerful role in taming these rough settlements, often doing what badges and bullets couldn't accomplish. Faith became one of the most effective crime-fighting tools the frontier had. Churches arrived almost as quickly as saloons in most Wild West towns. Ministers traveled the dusty trails right alongside settlers, carrying Bibles instead of six-shooters. These weren't your typical Sunday-only preachers either. They rolled up their sleeves and got involved in everything from settling disputes to organizing town meetings. When violence threatened to tear a community apart, religious leaders often stepped in as peacemakers. The influence went way deeper than Sunday sermons. Ministers frequently offered their church buildings as temporary courtrooms when no official courthouse existed. Picture a traveling judge holding trials between wooden pews with the 10 Commandments hanging right behind the witness stand. Many legal proceedings took place in these sacred spaces, and something interesting happened. People behaved differently inside a church. Even hardened criminals seemed to show more respect during trials held in religious buildings. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Religious moral codes directly influenced town laws in ways most people never realized. Those "thou shalt not" commandments found their way into city ordinances and legal statutes. Towns with strong church presence typically banned gambling, limited saloon hours, and created stricter penalties for theft and violence. The moral framework provided by religion gave communities a shared set of values to build their laws around. Churches also tackled crime prevention at its roots. Most frontier churches doubled as schools during weekdays, with ministers serving as teachers. These religious educators didn't just teach reading and arithmetic. They emphasized moral behavior, respect for authority, and the importance of community cooperation. Kids who attended church schools learned that stealing was wrong before they ever encountered a sheriff telling them the same thing. Then there's the charity angle, which proved surprisingly effective at reducing crime. Churches organized relief efforts for struggling families, providing food, clothing, and temporary shelter. When people had their basic needs met through religious charity, they were far less likely to turn to theft or other desperate measures. Ministers often knew which families were struggling and could intervene before poverty led to criminal behavior. Religious leaders also served as informal counselors and mediators. When neighbors feuded over property lines or business deals, they often brought their disputes to trusted ministers before involving the law. These religious arbitrators helped resolve countless conflicts that could have escalated into violence. Their moral authority carried weight that sometimes exceeded that of elected officials. Well, not all religious influence was gentle and peaceful. Some frontier churches supported vigilante justice when they believed it served the greater good. Ministers occasionally blessed vigilante committees, or provided moral justification for harsh punishments. They saw themselves as instruments of divine justice, especially when dealing with repeat offenders or particularly heinous crimes. The denominations varied widely across different regions. Catholic missions had long established influence in the Southwest, while Protestant churches dominated many of the newer settlements. Each brought different approaches to community involvement and crime prevention. Some emphasized forgiveness and rehabilitation, while others preached fire and brimstone consequences for wrongdoing. Religious gatherings created something invaluable in scattered frontier communities: regular social connections. Weekly church services brought isolated families together, strengthening community bonds that made crime less likely. People who worshipped together were less inclined to cheat, steal from, or fight with each other. These religious social networks created informal surveillance systems where antisocial behavior was quickly noticed and addressed. Churches also provided sanctuary in the literal sense. People fleeing violence or persecution could seek refuge in religious buildings, and most communities respected that protection. This tradition sometimes created tension when criminals claimed sanctuary, but it also helped diffuse volatile situations by providing cooling-off periods. The weird part is how much overlap existed between religious authority and secular law enforcement. Many frontier sheriffs and marshals were deeply religious men who saw their law enforcement duties as moral callings. They quoted scripture while making arrests and viewed crime fighting as spiritual warfare between good and evil. Female religious leaders, though less common, wielded considerable influence in frontier communities. Women often organized church social committees that kept tabs on community welfare and intervened when families faced crises that might lead to criminal behavior. These religious women's groups created support networks that prevented many potential crimes. Religious revivals and camp meetings served as powerful crime prevention tools. These emotional gatherings often led to public confessions, reconciliation between enemies, and community-wide commitments to moral behavior. The psychological impact of these mass religious experiences could transform entire towns, at least temporarily. Churches built the moral foundation that made formal law enforcement possible in Wild West communities. They created shared values, provided education, offered charity, and mediated disputes long before professional police forces arrived. But religious influence was just one piece of the puzzle. Communities also needed practical security measures to protect themselves, which meant organizing watches and patrols to guard against threats that prayers alone couldn't stop. When darkness fell on Wild West towns, danger didn't clock out. Most settlements didn't have streetlights, police patrols, or any fancy security systems. The night belonged to troublemakers, thieves, and anyone looking to settle scores under cover of darkness. Smart townsfolk figured out they needed to organize their own protection. Enter the Night Watch, groups of volunteers who took turns walking the streets with lanterns, clubs, and whatever weapons they could legally carry. These weren't trained security guards or professional lawmen. They were shopkeepers, farmers, and regular citizens who understood that keeping their town safe meant losing some sleep. The watch system worked pretty simply. Towns divided into districts, and each area got assigned a group of men who rotated shifts throughout the week. One night you might be watching the main street from sundown to midnight, and your neighbor would take the midnight to sunrise shift. Nobody got paid for this duty. It was just part of living in a frontier community where everyone had to pull their weight. These volunteer watchmen carried more than just lanterns and determination. Most towns equipped them with bells, whistles, or horns to signal trouble. A sharp blast meant fire. 3 quick toots warned of fighting or violence. A long, steady sound called for help from anyone within earshot. The weird part is how effective these simple communication systems proved to be in places where the nearest sheriff might be 20 miles away. Then there were the logbooks. Night watchmen kept detailed records of everything they saw during their rounds. Midnight, Johnson's store all secure, no lights in back. 2 a.m., heard shouting from Murphy's saloon, investigated, just card players arguing over rules. 4 a.m., strange horse tied behind bank, owner came out of hotel, false alarm. These notes help track patterns and suspicious behavior that might indicate bigger problems brewing. But what about actual attacks on the town itself? Some settlements faced threats from hostile Native American bands, outlaw gangs, or even neighboring communities in land disputes. A simple night watch wouldn't stop a coordinated raid, so certain towns invested in more serious defensive measures. Wooden stockades weren't uncommon in areas where violence was expected. These weren't massive fortifications like you'd see in military forts, just tall wooden fences with gates that could be barred shut when trouble approached. Most stockades only surrounded the main business district or the most valuable buildings. Houses on the outskirts remained vulnerable, but at least the town's economic heart had some protection. Signal systems became crucial for coordination between different defensive groups. A bell tower in the center of town could alert everyone within miles that danger was approaching. Some communities set up relay systems with neighboring settlements. If one town spotted raiders heading east, they'd send a messenger to warn the next community down the trail. Let's not forget the human element in all this defensive planning. Night watchmen got to know every building, every resident, and every normal sound their town made after dark. They could tell the difference between a drunk cowboy stumbling home and someone trying to break into the general store. This intimate knowledge made them incredibly effective at spotting trouble before it escalated. The social aspect of watch duty created unexpected benefits too. Men who might barely speak during the day found themselves talking for hours during long night shifts. Partnerships formed, business deals got discussed, and community bonds strengthened. Many towns discovered that their night watch system brought neighbors together in ways that daylight activities never could. Some settlements faced unique challenges that required creative solutions. Mining towns worried about claim jumpers sneaking around in darkness. Cattle towns watched for rustlers trying to steal livestock under cover of night. Railroad stops kept eyes open for train robbers scouting their next target. Each type of community adapted their defensive measures to match their specific vulnerabilities. Weather could make night watch duty absolutely miserable. Rain turned dirt streets into mud pits, snow made walking treacherous, and wind extinguished lanterns at the worst possible moments. Watchmen learned to dress in layers, carry spare matches, and find shelter spots where they could still observe their assigned areas during storms. The arrival of professional lawmen didn't immediately end night watch systems in most towns. Many communities kept their volunteer patrols even after hiring a marshal or sheriff. Extra eyes and ears on the streets never hurt, especially since most lawmen worked alone and couldn't be everywhere at once. What made these defensive efforts truly special was how they created a sense of shared responsibility. Everyone knew that their safety depended on everyone else doing their part. This wasn't just about stopping crime, it was about building the kind of community where people looked out for each other. Of course, all this organization and defensive planning was just one piece of keeping frontier towns safe. The real test came when danger actually arrived, and someone had to step up and face it head-on. That's where the true character of Wild West lawmen would shine through, or crack under pressure. Being a lawman in the Wild West wasn't exactly a career most folks dreamed about as kids. The pay was terrible, the hours were endless, and there was always a decent chance someone might take a shot at you on any given Tuesday. Yet somehow men stepped up to pin on that badge anyway. Most sheriffs and marshals earned between $50 and $100 a month, if the town could afford to pay them at all. That's roughly what a decent store clerk made back east. Except store clerks didn't have to break up knife fights or chase horse thieves across 50 miles of desert. Some lawmen worked other jobs just to make ends meet. They'd sheriff by day and run a general store by evening, or farm on weekends between arresting drunks. The daily routine of a Wild West lawman was far less glamorous than legend suggests. Most days started with checking on prisoners in the tiny town jail, usually just a few drunks sleeping off their Saturday night mistakes. Then came the endless rounds through town, settling disputes between neighbors, breaking up arguments over card games and making sure the local saloons weren't getting too rowdy before noon. But here's where things got tricky for these badge-wearing men. Everyone in town knew them personally. The sheriff's wife bought groceries from the same store as the troublemakers he arrested. His kids went to school with the children of men he'd thrown in jail. When you're trying to enforce the law in a community of 300 people, neutrality becomes nearly impossible. Personal relationships made every arrest a potential disaster. What happens when your brother-in-law gets drunk and starts a fight? What if the man who loaned you money to buy your farm decides he doesn't like your interpretation of the law? Some lawmen found themselves caught between family loyalty and professional duty on a regular basis. Others discovered that their authority vanished the moment they crossed certain powerful families in town. The equipment situation was equally challenging. Most lawmen owned their own guns, their own horses, and even their own handcuffs if they had any at all. Towns rarely provided much beyond the badge itself. A lucky sheriff might get a small budget for prisoner meals, but many ended up paying jail expenses out of their own pockets. Some communities expected their lawmen to use his personal horse for chasing criminals, which meant feeding and caring for the animal on a lawman's salary. Night shifts were particularly rough. Many towns had no streetlights, no backup, and no way to quickly call for help. A marshal making his evening rounds walked through dark alleys and empty streets, never knowing if trouble was waiting around the next corner. Some carried lanterns which helped them see but also made them perfect targets for anyone looking to cause problems. The social pressure was constant and exhausting. Successful lawmen had to know everyone's name, family situation and personal history. They needed to understand which families had feuds going back years, which businesses were struggling, and which young men were likely to cause trouble on payday. This wasn't just small talk, it was survival information that could mean the difference between preventing a fight and walking into an ambush. Then there's the weird part about authority in these small communities. A lawman's power came entirely from the people who elected him, and those same people could vote him out just as quickly. Upset the wrong group of voters, and you'd find yourself jobless within months. Some sheriffs lasted decades because they understood this delicate balance. Others got run out of town after a single controversial arrest. Training was essentially non-existent. New lawmen learned on the job, often from whoever was willing to show them the ropes. Some got advice from former soldiers who understood discipline and tactics. Others just winged it and hoped for the best. Legal knowledge was particularly sketchy. Many marshals had only a rough understanding of what was actually illegal versus what was just socially unacceptable. The loneliness was brutal for lawmen in smaller towns. The job naturally created distance between the sheriff and other residents. People were friendly enough, but there was always that underlying tension. You couldn't completely relax at social gatherings when half the attendees had been in your jail at some point. Many lawmen's wives struggled with the social isolation too, finding themselves caught between community friendships and their husbands' professional duties. Most lawmen didn't last more than a few years in the job. The combination of low pay, high stress, and social complications drove many back to farming, shopkeeping, or other trades. Some moved to different towns where they could start fresh, but the problems usually followed them. Others hung up their badges and never looked back. Yet, despite all these challenges, the communities that managed to keep good lawmen for several years saw remarkable improvements in safety and order. But what happened when these ordinary men with badges faced extraordinary situations like the legendary gunfights that would define the Wild West forever? The most famous gunfight in Wild West history lasted exactly 30 seconds. That's barely enough time to microwave a Hot Pocket. Yet the gunfight at the OK Corral became the stuff of legends that Hollywood still can't stop making movies about. But here's what really happened in Tombstone, Arizona, on October 26, 1881. The Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, along with their friend Doc Holliday, faced off against the Clanton and McClory brothers in a vacant lot. The whole thing started over cattle-rustling accusations and personal grudges that had been simmering for months. When the smoke cleared, 3 men were dead and 2 were wounded. The newspapers went absolutely wild. What made this shootout different wasn't the violence, it was the aftermath. Most gunfights in the Wild West involved drunken arguments or personal disputes that everyone forgot about within a week. This one sparked newspaper headlines across the country and court cases that dragged on for months. Wyatt Earp became a household name, which is pretty impressive considering most people back then couldn't even name their own sheriff. The weird part is how rare these dramatic shootouts actually were. Towns like Dodge City, famous for being rough and tumble, averaged maybe 1 or 2 gunfights per year. Compare that to modern cities where violence happens daily, and the Wild West starts looking pretty tame. Most sheriffs went entire careers without drawing their weapon in anger. Then there's the Jesse James Gang's shootouts, which were less about honor and more about escaping with stolen money. These weren't noble duels at high noon, they were desperate criminals trying not to get caught. The James Gang's most famous gunfight happened during a bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota in 1876. The townspeople fought back so hard that most of the gang ended up dead or captured. Jesse barely escaped, and the whole thing was over in minutes. What's fascinating is how these brief moments of violence shaped entire communities for decades. After a major shootout, towns would often ban firearms completely within city limits. Tombstone passed stricter gun laws within weeks of the OK Corral incident. Dodge City put up signs warning visitors to check their weapons at the sheriff's office or face arrest. But most shootouts weren't between lawmen and outlaws, they were between regular people who let arguments get out of hand. A card game gone wrong, a dispute over a woman, someone calling someone else a cheat or a coward. These personal grudges exploded into violence because honor meant everything in a world where your reputation was your most valuable possession. The reality of Wild West gunfights would disappoint anyone expecting a Hollywood showdown. Most happened at close range, often in saloons or on dusty streets. Nobody counted to 10 or walked 20 paces. Men pulled guns fast and shot faster, usually missing their targets because shooting accurately under pressure is incredibly difficult. Let's not forget how these shootouts affected the families left behind. When the town's only doctor got killed in a gunfight, everyone suffered. When a store owner died defending his shop, his widow might have to sell everything and move back east. These weren't just dramatic moments, they were community disasters that changed people's lives forever. The strangest part about famous shootouts is how they grew in the telling. The OK Corral fight probably involved 8 or 9 shots total, but by the time the story reached newspapers in New York, it sounded like a full-scale war. Writers added details that never happened and quotes that nobody ever said. Within 10 years, the truth was buried under layers of exciting fiction. Some towns actually used their famous gunfights as marketing tools. Tourism wasn't big in the 1880s, but communities discovered that having a notorious shootout in your past brought visitors and investment. Tombstone started advertising itself as the town too tough to die, partly because of what happened at the OK Corral. What really changed after famous shootouts wasn't just the laws, it was how people thought about violence. Communities that experienced dramatic gunfights often became the most peaceful places in the West. Nobody wanted to live through that kind of chaos again. They hired better lawmen, built stronger jails, and created social organizations to resolve disputes before they turned deadly. The impact of these legendary 30-second encounters lasted far longer than the violence itself. They showed communities what happened when law and order broke down, and most people decided they didn't like what they saw. While famous shootouts grabbed headlines and shaped legends, the daily grind of keeping communities safe involved much less dramatic but far more important work. The real story of Wild West law enforcement wasn't written in gunpowder and blood, but in the patient efforts of ordinary people building something better. The Wild West wasn't always wild. That's the thing nobody talks about when they're spinning tales of shootouts and bank robberies. Crime rates in these frontier towns actually dropped like a stone once people figured out how to live together without killing each other over card games. Take the early mining camps of California during the 1849 gold rush. Rough places, sure. Murder rates hit 25 per 100,000 people in some camps. That's brutal by any standard. But here's what happened next. Within 5 years, those same communities saw their murder rates cut in half. By the 1870s, most established Western towns had murder rates lower than Boston or New York City. The pattern repeated everywhere settlers put down roots. First came the chaos. Men with too much money, too much whiskey, and too few rules. Violence flared over mining claims, card games, and perceived slights that wouldn't even raise an eyebrow back east. Then something interesting happened. People got tired of burying their neighbors. Dodge City tells the story perfectly. In 1876, the town recorded 15 murders. Sounds like a lot until you realize that represented the peak of violence, not the norm. By 1879, murders dropped to just 5. By 1885, the number fell to 0. What changed? The cattle drives moved on, the saloons got regulated, and the people who stayed wanted quiet lives more than wild ones. But why did crime drop so fast in these places? The answer isn't what you'd expect. It wasn't because sheriffs got better at their jobs or because jails got bigger. Crime fell because communities learned to spot trouble before it exploded. Early settlements attracted drifters, gamblers, and men running from something. These folks didn't stick around long enough to care about the town's future. They caused problems and moved on. The people who stayed, the shopkeepers, farmers, and family men, they had different priorities. They wanted their kids to walk to school safely, and their businesses to prosper without getting robbed every other week. Then there's the communication factor. Telegraph lines changed everything. A sheriff in Kansas could warn a marshal in Colorado about troublemakers heading west. Wanted posters spread faster than gossip. Criminals couldn't just ride to the next town and start fresh anymore. The network of lawmen began sharing information like a primitive internet made of copper wire and horse messengers. Railroad development played a huge role too. Trains brought more people, more supplies, and more opportunities for legitimate work. When a man could earn decent wages building houses or working in a general store, robbing stagecoaches seemed less appealing. Economic stability reduced desperation, and desperation drove most frontier crime. Community organizations made the biggest difference though. Churches didn't just preach morality, they created social pressure that kept people in line. Business associations pushed for better law enforcement because crime was bad for trade. Women's groups organized charity drives that helped struggling families avoid turning to theft. These weren't official law enforcement, but they were more effective than most badges. The weird part is how fast towns could transform from dangerous to downright boring. Tombstone, Arizona provides a perfect example. Famous for the gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881, right? Well, by 1885, the same newspaper that once reported weekly shootings was complaining that nothing exciting ever happened anymore. The editor actually wrote that the town had become tediously peaceful. Crime patterns shifted too. Early frontier violence was mostly personal, disputes over women, card games, or business deals gone wrong. As towns matured, crime became more like what we see today. Petty theft, public drunkenness, and domestic disputes replaced the dramatic shootouts that made headlines. Professional law enforcement evolved alongside changing crime patterns. Early marshals were often just tough guys willing to take the job. By the 1880s, towns wanted lawmen who could read, write reports, and work with courts. The job required less gunfighting and more paperwork. Makes sense, right? Statistics from the time period reveal something surprising. Between 1870 and 1890, while eastern cities saw crime rates climb with immigration and industrialization, western towns experienced the opposite trend. Places like Denver, San Antonio and Sacramento became safer than Chicago or Philadelphia. Even cattle towns, supposedly the wildest places in the West, cleaned up their act remarkably fast. Abilene, Kansas, averaged 12 murders per year during its peak cattle drive period from 1867 to 1871. By 1875, with the cattle trade moved elsewhere, the town reported 0 murders for 3 consecutive years. The transformation wasn't perfect everywhere. Mining boomtowns still saw violent spikes when new gold or silver strikes brought fresh waves of fortune hunters. But even these communities learned from other towns' experiences, implementing gun controls and hiring experienced lawmen from the start. What emerges from all this data is a clear picture of adaptation and learning. The Wild West wasn't tamed by legendary gunfighters or cavalry charges. It was civilized by ordinary people who decided they preferred predictable lives to exciting ones. But here's what really matters about these changing crime rates. The stories we tell ourselves about the Wild West come mostly from those early violent years. The boring, peaceful decades that followed don't make for good movies or dime novels. Yet understanding this transformation reveals something crucial about how myths get created and why they persist. Popular culture painted the Wild West as a place where gunslinging outlaws ruled the streets and shootouts happened every Tuesday afternoon. Hollywood westerns showed dusty towns where everyone packed iron and violence erupted faster than you could say draw. The reality: most frontier settlers never fired a gun in anger during their entire lives. Think about what you've seen in movies. Cowboys swagger into saloons, guns blazing, bank robberies happen weekly. Sheriffs face down notorious outlaws in dramatic duels at high noon. Well, here's the thing: actual historical records tell a completely different story. Bank robberies were so rare that newspapers from 3 states away would cover a single heist. Between 1859 and 1900, fewer than 10 bank robberies occurred across the entire American frontier. That's less than 1 every 4 years. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral lasted 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Most Hollywood versions drag it out longer than a soap opera confession scene. Meanwhile, real frontier towns like Dodge City averaged maybe 2 murders per year during their wildest periods. Compare that to modern crime rates, and those lawless communities look downright peaceful. But why did these myths take root so strongly? Newspapers played a huge role. Editors discovered that stories about Wild West violence sold papers faster than accounts of successful wheat harvests or new church construction. A single shootout in Tombstone would get covered in newspapers from New York to San Francisco, each version growing more dramatic with distance. Meanwhile, the months of quiet daily life between incidents never made headlines. Then there's the curious case of the dime novel. These cheap paperback books flooded eastern cities with tales of Western adventure. Publishers cranked out stories featuring the same famous outlaws over and over, creating fictional adventures that readers assumed were real. Jesse James supposedly robbed more banks in dime novels than actually existed in Missouri. Billy the Kid killed more men in fiction than lived in some entire counties. Real frontier life looked nothing like these dramatic stories. Most people worked dawn to dusk just to survive. Farmers worried about crop failures and weather. Shopkeepers struggled to keep goods in stock when supply wagons were weeks late. Women spent endless hours cooking, cleaning and caring for children in one-room cabins. Exciting, hardly, but it was real life for hundreds of thousands of Western settlers. Let's not forget how gun laws actually worked in frontier towns. Dodge City, supposedly the wildest place in the West, banned firearms within city limits. Visitors had to check their weapons at the sheriff's office or leave them at the edge of town. Signs posted throughout Dodge reminded everyone that carrying guns was illegal. Tombstone had similar rules. These weren't lawless places, they were communities desperately trying to maintain order and attract respectable businesses. The myth of constant violence also ignores how community cooperation actually shaped frontier life. When someone's barn burned down, neighbors showed up to help rebuild. When children were orphaned, families took them in. When disputes arose, people gathered to talk through solutions. Violence was the exception, not the rule, because small communities couldn't survive if everyone was shooting at each other. Even the famous outlaws weren't quite what legend suggests. Jesse James spent most of his time hiding on family farms, not robbing trains. Billy the Kid worked as a ranch hand between his brief moments of notoriety. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid often went months without committing any crimes at all. Their actual criminal careers were short, sporadic, and far less glamorous than movies suggest. And the weird part is how quickly these myths replaced reality in popular memory. By 1920, people who had actually lived in frontier towns found themselves contradicting their own neighbors about what the Wild West was really like. The legends had become more powerful than the facts. Modern research reveals the truth, hiding behind decades of tall tales. Court records, newspaper archives, and personal diaries paint a picture of communities working hard to establish law and order. Towns competed to attract families and businesses by proving they were safe and civilized. Violence was bad for business, and everyone knew it. Professional lawmen weren't legendary gunfighters. They were ordinary men trying to keep the peace with limited resources and little training. Most spent their days settling minor disputes, collecting taxes, and dealing with drunks. The dramatic showdowns that fill Western movies happened so rarely that when they did occur, people talked about them for decades. The real Wild West was actually wilder in a different way. Wild in its diversity, its innovation, and its rapid transformation from empty prairie to thriving communities. People from dozens of countries and backgrounds worked together to build something new. That story is far more interesting than any shootout, but it doesn't make for easy Hollywood drama. Understanding these myths versus reality helps explain something important about how societies remember their past. But the bigger question remains, how did these early experiments in frontier justice shape the legal systems that followed? The Wild West wasn't just about dusty streets and quick-draw showdowns. Behind all those Hollywood myths lies something far more interesting, actual lessons that shaped how justice works in America. These frontier communities figured out things about law and order that we're still using today. Community involvement made the difference between chaos and safety. When everyone knew their neighbors and had a stake in keeping things peaceful, towns stayed remarkably quiet. People didn't just wait for the sheriff to handle problems. They organized night watches, formed committees, and kept an eye on troublemakers. This wasn't vigilante madness, it was practical cooperation. The beauty of this system, speed and simplicity. No endless court delays or legal technicalities. Someone stole a horse, the whole town knew about it by noon, and justice happened fast. But here's the key part, most people miss. This only worked because the community agreed on what was right and wrong. Shared values meant shared solutions. Then there's the flexibility factor. Early settlers couldn't just copy laws from back east and hope they'd work on the frontier. Mining camps needed different rules than farming towns. Cattle drives brought different problems than railroad construction. Smart communities adapted their approach to fit local needs rather than forcing square pegs into round holes. Fast justice had serious advantages when done right. Criminals couldn't disappear into the wilderness while lawyers argued for months. Victims got closure quickly. The whole community saw that breaking the law had real consequences, but speed also meant mistakes happened, and innocent people sometimes got punished before all the facts came out. The most successful towns learned to balance quick action with careful investigation. They'd hold public meetings where witnesses could speak up and evidence got examined. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but it beat having no justice system at all. And the weird part is, many of these improvised courts were fairer than official ones in big cities. Law systems grew naturally as problems got more complex. A town might start with just a part-time marshal who also ran the general store. As population increased and crime became more varied, they'd hire full-time lawmen, build proper jails, and write down actual legal codes. This organic growth meant the justice system matched what each community actually needed. Early mistakes became valuable learning experiences. Towns that let vigilante groups run wild usually regretted it later. Communities that were too lenient found themselves overrun by troublemakers. The smart ones found the middle ground. Firm but fair, quick but careful. These lessons spread from town to town as people shared stories and compared notes. Women played bigger roles in frontier justice than most people realize. They organized moral reform societies, pushed for better schools, and often had the final say on whether a troublemaker should be run out of town. Mothers didn't want their children growing up around violence and vice, so they became powerful forces for law and order. Religious leaders provided more than just Sunday sermons. Ministers often served as mediators in disputes, ran schools that taught respect for law, and offered their churches as meeting places for community discussions about justice. They helped create the moral foundation that made quick, simple justice work. The importance of knowing everyone in town can't be overstated. When the sheriff knew which cowboys got mean when drunk, which miners had quick tempers, and which families were struggling financially. He could prevent problems before they started. Personal relationships made law enforcement more human and more effective. But what happens when rapid growth destroyed that intimate community feeling? Bigger towns had to develop more formal systems. They couldn't rely on everyone knowing everyone else's business. This transition from personal to institutional justice was messy but necessary. Local history still shapes Western communities today. Drive through small towns across the region, and you'll see the legacy everywhere. Town squares where public meetings happened. Old jails that housed troublemakers for short, sharp sentences. Churches that served as courtrooms and community centers. The physical layout tells the story of how justice evolved. Modern policing borrowed heavily from these frontier experiments. Community policing programs that emphasize knowing the neighborhood and preventing crime rather than just responding to it. That's straight out of the Wild West playbook. The idea that law enforcement works best when it has community support and involvement. Frontier towns proved that concept over and over. The real lesson isn't that the old ways were perfect. They weren't. It's that effective justice systems grow from the ground up, adapting to local needs while maintaining core principles of fairness and community involvement. These frontier communities proved that ordinary people could create extraordinary solutions when they worked together. What they built wasn't always pretty or sophisticated, but it worked well enough to tame a continent and create the foundation for modern law enforcement. As railroads and telegraphs finally connected these scattered settlements to the wider world, everything was about to change once again. By the 1890s, something remarkable was happening across the American West. The era of makeshift justice and frontier chaos was coming to an end. Not with a bang or dramatic shootout, but with the steady click-clack of railroad tracks and the hum of telegraph wires stretching across the plains. The railroads changed everything. What once took weeks of dangerous travel by wagon now took days by train. Towns that had been isolated islands of civilization suddenly found themselves connected to Chicago, St. Louis, and the rest of America. Mail arrived daily instead of monthly. News traveled in hours, not seasons. When trouble broke out in a small Colorado mining town, help could arrive from Denver before the dust settled. Telegraph lines followed the railroad tracks like faithful companions. Sheriffs could now wire descriptions of wanted criminals to neighboring counties instantly. Bank robbers found it much harder to disappear when their faces and crimes were known 3 towns ahead of their escape route. The Jesse James gang might have thrived in the 1870s, but by the 1890s their style of hit-and-run banditry was becoming nearly impossible. Professional law enforcement arrived with the improved transportation. The days of electing the local blacksmith as sheriff were fading fast. States began requiring training for lawmen. Police departments in larger western cities hired experienced officers from back east. These weren't part-time farmers carrying badges anymore. They were full-time professionals who understood legal procedures and proper investigation techniques. Federal courts expanded their reach too. Instead of waiting months for a traveling judge to arrive by horseback, regular court sessions were established in county seats throughout the West. Lawyers became more common, and legal procedures grew more standardized. The rough-and-ready justice of miners' courts and vigilante committees seemed primitive by comparison. But here's the interesting twist. Many communities didn't want to give up their old ways entirely. Some towns had grown attached to their simplified approach to justice. Why complicate things with lengthy trials when everyone knew who stole Mrs. Henderson's chickens? Local traditions died hard, especially in smaller settlements. The changing economy played a huge role too. The great cattle drives that brought rowdy cowboys to end-of-trail towns were ending. Railroads could transport beef more efficiently than driving herds hundreds of miles. Those wild nights in Dodge City and Abilene became memories as the cattle business moved closer to ranches and rail yards. Mining booms were settling down as well. The frantic gold rushes that created overnight towns full of desperate fortune seekers were mostly over. What remained were established mining operations with regular workers, steady paychecks, and predictable lives. Stable communities don't produce the same crime rates as chaotic boom towns. Then there's the simple fact that the West was filling up. Empty spaces that once hid outlaws were being carved into farms and ranches. A bandit couldn't ride for days without seeing another soul anymore. Neighbors were everywhere, and neighbors meant witnesses. The vast, lawless frontier was becoming a patchwork of organized communities. Women's influence grew stronger as families became more established. Churches multiplied, schools opened, and social organizations flourished. These institutions created webs of accountability that made crime less likely and less tolerated. A man might think twice about starting trouble when his wife, preacher, and neighbors all knew about it. The romanticized image of the Wild West was already taking shape, ironically, just as the real thing was disappearing. Dime novels and traveling shows were creating legends about gunfighters and outlaws that bore little resemblance to actual frontier life. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which started touring in 1883, presented an exciting but fictional version of Western life to audiences who had never seen the real thing. Newspapers were part of this myth-making too. Crime stories from the frontier had always sold papers back east, but now editors were discovering that nostalgic stories about the good old days of the Wild West were just as popular. Never mind that most people who actually lived through those days were relieved to see them end. By 1900, most Western towns looked remarkably similar to their Eastern counterparts. They had proper police forces, established courts, brick buildings, electric lights, and telephone service. The frontier justice system had evolved into something recognizably modern. What's fascinating is how quickly this transformation happened. A town that was dealing with vigilante hangings in 1875 might have a professional police chief, municipal court, and electric streetlights by 1895. 20 years was enough to completely revolutionize law and order across the American West. The Wild West era was officially over, but its legend was just beginning. Movies, books, and television would keep the myth alive for generations. Most Americans today know more about fictional gunslingers than the real shopkeepers, farmers, and families who actually built Western communities. The real Wild West wasn't nearly as wild as we imagine, and that's probably for the best.